Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is portfolio questions, and the first portfolio is Wellbeing, Economy, Net Zero and Energy. I would remind members, if they would wish to seek to ask a supplementary question, they should press the request to speak buttons during the relevant question or indicate so by entering the letters RTS in the chat function if online. And at question number 1, I call Katy Clark.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide further details of its reasons for the removal of its annual and interim targets for carbon emissions.
Minister Richard Lochhead.
As the member is aware, the Scottish Government proposed a 70% target for 2030 in the 2019 Act, and it was a Scottish Labour amendment, of course, that proposed that 75% reduction, which the Climate Change Committee advised was likely unachievable. And while the cross-party ambition of Parliament was clear, there is no doubt that Parliament understood the scale of the challenge. The Climate Change Committee has now firmly assessed that the target for 2030 is not feasible, which we accept in the challenging context of UK cuts and backtracking. Our current rigid linear annual target approach is not fit for purpose, poorly reflecting realities like harsher winters, and does not allow precision in estimating impact of developing technologies.
Katy Clark.
In 2020, the UK Climate Change Committee wrote to the Scottish Government saying that interim targets were difficult but not impossible to achieve, and outlining what needed to be done to achieve them. Does the Minister not accept that the action needed was not taken, but also that now we need to set out a plan to achieve the maximum reductions and set out targets given the climate emergency and the impact this has on humanity?
Minister.
Well, it is really important we all do work together to look at the impact on humanity and make sure this Parliament hopefully can unite around the measures required to reduce emissions and achieve our overall net zero targets in Scotland. And I think we can all agree on that. All members are obviously aware that often when some of the proposals come forward, suddenly political bandwagons are created and parties jump onto them, and there's political opposition to some of the measures we do have to take to reduce emissions in Scotland. It could be low emission zones, it could be deposit return schemes. There's a whole host of issues in my time in Parliament that the government's put forward and opposition parties oppose. So therefore it's very difficult to make progress under these circumstances. We have to unite where possible and move forward with these long-term targets and with our carbon budgets, which of course the rest of the UK follow, and work together to achieve those ambitions.
Question number 2, Marie McNair.
To ask the Scottish Government how its long-term labour market strategy is helping to make Scotland a fairer country.
Minister Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While employment law remains reserved to the UK Government, we are promoting fairer work practices across the labour market in Scotland. Despite challenging conditions, the latest labour market statistics demonstrate positive progress on labour market inequalities, including the gender pay gap and the disability employment gap. Our approach to employability aims to tackle inequalities in Scotland's labour market by creating a system that meets the needs of employers and helps people of all ages who experience barriers to participate in Scotland's labour market to achieve their potential. And our skills system will support these ambitions as we take the lead on national skills planning while strengthening regional approaches.
Marie McNair.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The Conservative Party have accused people of over-medicalising everyday challenges and worries of life, and this is from an extremely financially privileged individual who has never had to experience the worry and adversity that his party has forced on people up and down Scotland. Can I ask the Minister how this SNP Scottish Government intends to continue protecting people from the worst abuses of Tory mismanagement?
Minister.
I would just like to say to Ms McNair that I know exactly the reference that she was making. I was appalled by the language used by the Prime Minister. He talked about a sick note culture alongside an anti-workers' right, anti-trade union agenda, which does nothing to support people accessing the labour market, neither employers with recruitment and retention. By contrast, we in Scotland treat people with fairness, dignity and respect by developing a wellbeing economy and tackling structural inequalities. As I said, this means promoting fairer work practices across the labour market in Scotland through our approach to employability, meeting the needs of employers and helping people of all ages who experience barriers and working together to take those barriers down.
And supplementary, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A fundamental part of the Scottish Government's labour market strategy and fair work policy is the promotion of the real living wage. And I know the Scottish Government wants all those who are engaging in procurement with Scottish Government to pay the real living wage. When members of this Parliament's Economy and Fair Work Committee visited Prestwick Airport last week, an institution wholly owned by Scottish ministers, we were horrified to find out that that institution does not pay the real living wage. So when the Minister talks about fairness, dignity and respect for workers, should she not begin at home?
Minister.
Obviously, I wasn't on that visit to Prestwick Airport, and Murdo Fraser raises something which I will feed back to the Cabinet Secretary and officials, because obviously I have to investigate that. We need to investigate ourselves.
I call question number 3, Graham Simpson.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government regarding its work to secure a sustainable future for Ferguson Marine, what discussions the Net Zero Secretary has had with ministerial colleagues regarding potential plans for a direct award of the small vessel replacement programme contract to Ferguson Marine.
Minister Richard Lockhead.
As ministers have advised Parliament previously, a direct award of public contracts is possible only in strict, limited circumstances under public procurement rules. So ministers are currently evaluating the business case for the small vessel replacement programme, and all ministers with a portfolio interest in the programme are connected to that in the normal way.
Graham Simpson.
Before he was cruelly dumped, the former CEO, David Tideman, produced a series of investment asks of the government which could secure the yard's future. Now, this business plan went to the Cabinet Secretary, unfortunately not here today, on April the 5th. So how much is the Minister prepared to invest to upgrade the yard, and does he foresee it getting any government contracts soon?
Minister.
Well, as the member, I'm sure, is also aware, ministers have also informed Parliament that they are currently considering the business case for further investment, and that's an ongoing process within the government, and that ministers are committed to updating Parliament as soon as there's any progress with that or any news to give to MSPs in Parliament. So it's something, of course, we're taking seriously. We want to do everything we can to support the jobs going forward, but clearly we have to consider the business case that has been put forward, and Parliament will be updated in due course.
Supplementary, Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister has said that a direct award is, under procurement rules, possible only in strictly limited circumstances. Can he say what those circumstances are, and has the Scottish Government spoken to UK counterparts to ascertain whether the UK Government would support a direct order, or if the Subsidy Control Act would come into play, And when will we have a final decision on the award of this contract?
Minister.
Well, the procurement law requirements in which a contract can be directly awarded are set out in the Public Contracts Scotland Regulations of 2015. And the question of subsidy control compliance, of course, also has to be considered separately. Our consideration of a direct award has to date not necessitated engagement with the UK Government. Of course, that may arise. I can't predict what the case will be. And as I said to the previous member, ministers are currently considering the issues and will update Parliament accordingly.
And supplementary, Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Minister refers to the subsidy control regime restricting potential state aid for investment at Ferguson Marine, but has he considered that one of the key asks in the investment plan is a new panel line, yet there are already 2 existing panel lines in Scotland, in Govan and in Rosyth, as well as a third being installed currently in Belfast? Has he considered that a way around this restriction is to actually take a sector-wide approach and pool the resources available in shipbuilding steelwork across Scotland to draw on it for Ferguson Marine's future programmes?
Minister.
Well, I'll certainly draw the member's point to the attention of the Cabinet Secretary, and I'm sure that will be taken into account. And of course, all the issues at the moment are being considered. But of course, as I said before, there are a number of specific issues that have to be considered in terms of the business case, and Parliament will be updated in due course.
Question number 4, Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions the Energy Minister has had with ministerial colleagues regarding any support it provides to communities opposing onshore wind farm developments at public inquiries.
Minister Gillian Martin.
The onshore wind sector deal in Scotland sets out that onshore wind will continue to collaborate with local communities, building good practices to enhance the existing good neighbour approach through engagement at all stages of the project life cycle, offering impactful community benefits and practical routes to shared ownership. I can confirm I have no discussions with ministerial colleagues regarding live applications. Scottish ministers have been fully cooperating with the Citizens' Participation in Public Petitions Committee regarding a live petition seeking to increase the ability of communities to influence planning decisions for onshore wind farms.
Oliver Mundell.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The current process is far from fair or equitable, with local communities and residents facing aggressive and humiliating questioning from legal representatives desperate to deliver consent for their clients. Worse still, useful video evidence from past inquiries showing such behaviour has been removed and prevents scrutiny and denies new objectors the chance to familiarise themselves with the likely process. Does the Minister agree that local communities deserve legal representation when it's clearly a combative process? And will she ask the DPEA to look again at the decision to remove videos from their website?
Minister.
Thank Oliver Mundell for that. It's an issue that he has raised a couple of times in the Chamber, and I have been obviously aware of some of the issues that he's said that people have faced. And obviously I go back to the petition. The ask in the petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to appoint an independent advocate to ensure that local participants are not bullied or intimidated at public local inquiries. Reporters are, however, instructed to ensure that unrepresented partners are able to give their evidence in a safe environment. Where unrepresented parties are appearing at an inquiry, reporters confirm at the outset of the inquiry it's important that witnesses are treated courteously at all times, and especially when being cross-examined. And if any witness feels bullied or intimidated by the tone of cross-examination, they are advised to inform the reporter immediately.
Supplementary, Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the same vein, I've met with many concerned constituents near Newton Stewart and D&G who have concerns about proposed wind farm developments in Glenvernach and Blair Hill, which would see the tallest turbine height in Scotland onshore, despite the region already having one of the highest levels of wind farm developments anywhere in Scotland. I know the Minister cannot comment on live planning applications, but can she outline further what action constituents can take to ensure that the proposers adequately hear concerns and engage diligently with persons opposing developments?
Minister.
Well, I can confirm that applications for both proposals that Emma Harper has mentioned there have not been yet submitted to Scottish ministers. But she is right that even before that point I can't comment on the merit or otherwise. If a proposed development proceeds to an application stage, there are clear notification requirements to ensure that local communities and the general public are informed of submission to Scottish ministers. Members of the public may make representations and comment to the Scottish ministers on the applications. When an application application is ready to be determined, Scottish Ministers consider all relevant material available to them before making any decision. But I would implore the developers to have meaningful engagement with the constituents of Mr Mandel and Emma Harper on all their proposals well ahead of that process.
Question number 5, Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on what discussions it has had with Petroleum and trade unions about refining capacity at Grangemouth.
Minister Gillian Martin.
I thank Daniel Johnson for that question. The Scottish Government continues to engage extensively with Petroleum, and I most recently met Petroleum CEOs on the 27th of March and made clear the Scottish Government's commitment to continue to engage constructively with the business. Petroleum and the unions are also a member of the GFIB Leadership Forum, which I convened on the 28th of March. Ministers met with Unite and the STUC on the morning of the import terminal announcement. And out with the Grangemouth Future Industries Board, I met with unions at a Just Transition Commission roundtable in Falkirk on the 15th of March, which had representation from the wider Grangemouth community, Petroleum themselves, unions and the local authority. And I'll next meet Unite in June to further discuss this very important matter.
Daniel Johnson.
I thank the Minister for that detailed answer, but here's what I think we know. The most recent accounts from Petroleum show that the site is profitable. It has now secured investment in the hydrocracker, which was previously seen to be critical, and yet the plan to stop refining in 2025 is still in place. So can the Minister confirm what is her understanding about what factors motivate this commitment to disinvestment? Has it discussed these matters with PetroChina directly, given that the government has met with them and they are bankrolling much of this, or indeed any other potential investors? But most critically, is the government's objective to secure refining beyond 2025 on Grangemouth, or simply to mitigate the decisions being made elsewhere?
Minister.
Mr Johnson raises really important points. I mean, I'll have to point to the fact that these are commercial decisions that are making at Petroleum, and they have actually outlined them. I don't think, fair to air them in public about what their commercial and decisions have been based on, because I think that's confidential. But certainly one of the key aims of this government, working in partnership with the UK Government and indeed the Grangemouth wider community, is to see how we can secure the refinery for the future. One of the things that we're very keen to look at is it becoming a biorefinery. We're looking at ways in which we can influence UK Government to perhaps bring down the HEFA cap, so that they can look at maybe being one of the first movers in sustainable aviation fuel. I think that's one of the areas in which there really is an opportunity for the refinery, and actually our colleagues at Petroleum agree with that very much, and that's very much something we're working towards.
And supplementary, Evelyn Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister provide further information on how plans to develop a specific just transition plan for the Grangemouth industrial cluster will help secure a long-term sustainable future for the area?
Minister.
Our Just Transition Plan for the Grangemouth Industrial Cluster will outline a first-of-its-kind vision for the site, outlining the long-term net zero operations we would hope to see take place by 2045, some of which I mentioned to Daniel Johnson. Beyond this, our plan will also chart a series of actions that seek to secure this, focusing on securing long-term investment, developing technical and commercially viable solutions for manufacturing, the required policy development, as well as the skills and place-based activity required to support a prosperous net zero future for the area. This plan is being developed with those working in Grangemouth, with the communities, local employers, local authority, unions and many other stakeholders.
Question number 6, Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what due diligence is conducted by Home Energy Scotland when selecting recommended suppliers to install energy efficiency improvements that are supported by Scottish Government funding.
Minister Gillian Martin.
Home Energy Scotland is not responsible for selecting or recommending installers of energy efficient improvements, but applicants to the Home Energy Scotland grant and loan scheme are required to use an MCS accredited installer for heat pumps and other renewables, and a Trustmark registered installer for complex energy efficiency measures, including external wall insulation. HES recommends for all measures that households contact at least 3 installers, ensure the chosen installer is fully qualified, and seek a guarantee or warranty for the work carried out.
Cricoy.
Across Scotland, many colleges are saying that they are unable to recruit enough apprentices in order to be able to meet the demand that is forthcoming in order to deliver on the government's insulation plans and the net zero objectives. Will she therefore speak to the Further Education Minister to reverse funding cuts to Scotland's councils, which will only mean there will be more cowboy operators operating in government-funded schemes in Scotland?
Minister.
Tell Mr Hoy exactly what we're doing. We're working in partnership with the sector to ensure that appropriate support and training provision are aligned at local level with business needs and local demands. We've funded the Green Heat Installer Engagement Programme to provide assistance and support for installers in their clean heat transition, becoming accredited for the installation of heat pumps. And this included the MCS Certification Fund, which last year supported 24 businesses to become MCS certified. It is actually an issue that is of great importance. I have frequent conversations with Graham Day, who's in charge of obviously what overseeing what the colleges do. They are very alive to the fact that there are a number of streams of skills where they're going to have to really up their game in terms of actually producing a prospectus that's going to meet the demands for future skills.
A supplementary, Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Energy Savings Trust administer the grant and loan scheme for Home Energy Scotland. I've heard from suppliers about delays in processing applications, and the knock-on effect is that delayed payments to the businesses negatively impacts their cash flow. So while ensuring due diligence, what can the Scottish Government do to improve the process so local suppliers, which are often small businesses, can continue to support the ongoing and necessary energy efficiency installations?
Minister.
Well, our target is to always process applications of Home Energy Scotland claims within 10 working days once in receipt of the required documentation. We're very aware that the majority of those applications are actually delivered on time. But of course, obviously, a lot more can be done as we're rolling out this scheme to make sure that if there's any delays to anything, that's investigated and we develop processes. Well, they develop processes in place that improve on that.
Question number 7, Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what impact it anticipates its recent announcements on changes to its net zero targets will have on the development of a green economy.
Minister Richard Lockhead.
The need to amend the statutory trajectory targets towards our ambitious net zero targets is driven by legal necessity, and it follows all parties setting a target which was considered beyond what could be reasonably achieved. And our recent announcements in no way detract from the scale of our ambitions for tackling climate change, including via our energy transition, which presents enormous economic opportunities for Scotland, as well as the risks that have to be managed, of course. And we remain committed to realising those opportunities in Scotland for our businesses and workers and supporting a just transition.
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the Minister for that response. The Nuclear Industry Association has warned that Scotland's green economy risks losing billions in investment thanks to the SNP's short-sighted opposition to new nuclear developments. Now that the Greens are no longer in government, will the Minister use this opportunity to consider nuclear power as a means of bolstering Scotland's green economy and strengthening energy security?
Minister.
Only a Tory could intervene and call for more attention and focus on nuclear when Scotland's in the middle of a green energy revolution in terms of jobs from offshore winds. Can I draw members' attention to the P&J from around a week ago, where Ian Wood said this decision in terms of the offshore floating wind farm that was given consent, this decision will unlock around £3 billion of investment, generate hundreds of jobs and will effectively result in Europe's first commercially scaled floating wind development. This is phenomenal developments happening across Scotland at the moment. Let's not waste time and resources on decades of lost opportunity focusing on nuclear when we've got this opportunity on our doorstep that's happening right now before our eyes. Let's create the jobs and green energy and power ourselves towards net zero.
Supplementary, Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To deliver a just transition, we need to make sure that Scotland's workforce have the skills needed by industry. So for workers in the oil and gas sector, approximately 80% of their skills could be used in renewables, but demonstrating those skills is a challenge. That's why we support the development of an energy skills passport, but it's been delayed and delayed. The former Minister for Green Skills said a passport would be delivered this April. April has gone and no announcement. So will the Minister intervene urgently, work with trade unions, industry and skills accreditation companies to get a passport in place as soon as possible to open those opportunities up for those workers in Scotland?
Minister.
The Energy Skills Passport, of course, is a key building block to getting towards the just transition, and it's something a lot of resource and time has been devoted to from ministers. But, of course, it's an industry-led initiative. It's, of course, been quite complex, as the member's aware. And the good news is we're expecting, hopefully, an announcement soon, so we'll hear about the progress that is being made. But, of course, it's industry-led. It is an important initiative, and, as I said before, it's something we have devoted resources towards because of its importance.
And brief supplementary, John Mason.
Thank you. Does the Minister agree with me that it's somewhat hypocritical of the Conservatives to be demanding more investment in net zero when the Conservative government has cut our capital budget?
Minister.
John Mason, of course, makes a perfectly valid and powerful point. It is hypocritical for the Conservatives to cut Scotland's capital budgets at a time when we've got the climate emergency and we want to address it and invest in the green energy revolution.
Members, please.
And then come here and complain about the lack of progress towards those targets. It's utter hypocrisy.
And question number 8, Colette Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the potential impact on hospitality and other businesses in Scotland of new post-Brexit import fees on food products known as the Common User Charge.
Minister Richard Lochhead.
The UK Government recently published its common user charge fees for government-run border control posts in England. Currently, there are no government-run BCPs in Scotland. However, it is anticipated this charge sets a market price signal, and clearly Scots traders using English ports will be affected. We will, of course, monitor any impacts on businesses and consumers, including, of course, those in our very important hospitality sector.
Colette Stevenson.
I thank the Minister for that response. Household budgets across Scotland have been decimated by the cost of living crisis, Liz Truss's mini-budget and Brexit, and now people are facing fees of up to £145 on items like fish, cheese and yoghurt. What steps are the Scottish Government taking, with the powers it has, to mitigate these harms being inflicted on the people of Scotland?
Minister.
Well, I heard the Conservative members sighing when the member mentioned the impact of UK Government policies on hospitality businesses in Scotland. And I would remind them that the Business Insight survey says that the top factors affecting businesses in Scotland are inflation and energy costs, both of which are at the door of the UK Government at the moment.
Cabinet Secretary, please resume your seat for a wee second. I won't have all this shouting across the chamber. The Minister has been asked a question. He is responding. Please have the courtesy to listen to his response. Minister.
But Colette Stevenson is quite right. Of course, recent press reports have highlighted concerns increasing costs will lead to a further price increase for consumers already struggling with the cost of living crisis. This, of course, is entirely because of Brexit, and it's entirely because of Brexit this latest raft of import controls has been introduced, and it's Brexit that Scotland didn't vote for, but we're paying a huge price, and no one can point to the benefits of Brexit. But this is yet more unnecessary damage being caused to the Scottish economy from it.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes portfolio questions on Wellbeing, Economy, Net Zero and Energy. There will be a very short pause before we move on to the next portfolio to allow frontbench teams to change position should they so wish. Thank you. Thank you. So the next portfolio is Finance, Deputy First Minister Responsibilities and Parliamentary Business. Again, should a member wish to seek to ask a supplementary question, they should press the request to speak button during the relevant question or enter the letters RTS in the chat function if online during the relevant question. I call question number 1, Rhoda Grant.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on when its review of capital spending will be complete.
Deputy First Minister Shona Robertson.
The capital outlook
is currently very challenging, with a 9% real terms cut in our capital funding from the UK Government. Work is underway to update the infrastructure pipeline to ensure that it is affordable, deliverable and provides the best value for money.
Rhoda Grant.
In the Highlands, a number of health projects have been paused. The maternity services upgrade, the new Belford Hospital for Fort William and the Caithness Health redesign. So all the while the construction costs are increasing while this pause and delay is in place. And that's adding greater costs to the investment, but it's also creating greater costs for the NHS Highland because they're having to manage that failing infrastructure. Can I ask when the review will be complete and what will be the value of the projects that get the go-ahead and what will be the value of the projects scrapped?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, first of all, can I say to Rhoda Grant that I do understand very much the issues that she is raising, but given the not just the cut to our capital budget, but of course the significant levels of construction inflation that has resulted in a reduction in our spending power on top of that capital cut, has meant we had no other choice than to revisit the pipeline of projects. That work, as I have said to Rhoda Grant in this chamber before, is underway to review the programmes relating to the 2021 infrastructure investment plan, as I said in my initial answer, to ensure it's affordable, deliverable and provides value for money. The refreshed infrastructure pipeline is intended to be published alongside the medium-term financial strategy, as it's right that future investment plans are embedded in wider thinking on fiscal sustainability, and that, of course, will include the reference to the health projects that Rhoda Grant mentioned in her question.
Supplementary, Alec Riley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Bus Partnership Fund has been paused despite local transport authorities spending a lot of time and money working up bids worth hundreds of millions of pounds that are clearly linked to the government strategy for hitting net zero and getting people out of cars and onto public transport. So how will the government prioritise, and can the Cabinet Secretary give an indication of when the Bus Partnership Fund will resume?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, of course, first of all, the Bus Partnership Fund sits within the Transport Secretary's portfolio, but clearly the support for the expansion of public transport is a key lever in our ambitions towards net zero. In terms of the prioritisation that Alex Rowley referred to, the work that is going on, not just in the infrastructure investment pipeline, but across the whole of government in terms of the capital priorities in the light of the construction costs inflation that I mentioned, the cut to our capital budget, but also the further cut to financial transaction availability has meant we have had to make very difficult decisions, but also look to prioritise, and that work is underway. And of course, when new First Minister comes into post, I'm sure they will also have a view on those priorities.
And supplementary, Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 2 weeks ago, I asked the Cabinet Secretary for Health when we might know more about the timetable to replace Shetland's Gilbert Bain Hospital. He acknowledged that certain parts of the 1950s design building are in a bad state. In light of the capital spending review, and as the Gilbert Bain Hospital is one of the oldest buildings in the Highlands and Islands, will the Deputy First Minister do all she can to ensure that progress towards a replacement hospital is forthcoming?
Deputy First Minister.
I will ask the Health Secretary to write to Beatrice Wishart, but I think really what I said to Rhoda Grant in terms of that infrastructure investment pipeline, the reasons that we are having to revisit that, which are multifaceted, the rise in construction costs, the cuts to capital budget, will apply to all of these projects. But I do understand both Beatrice Wishart's point and that of Rhoda Grant that giving certainty as early as possible is very important, and that's why the refreshed pipeline will be published alongside the medium-term financial strategy.
Question number 2, Maggie Chapman.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on work undertaken to resolve any public sector equal pay disputes.
Deputy First Minister.
The Scottish Government has a long-standing commitment to the principles of fair work, and the Fair Work Action Plan outlines the direct action we are taking to address labour market inequalities. All public bodies and local authorities need to ensure they comply with their legal obligations and are encouraged to work jointly with their trade unions in undertaking equal pay reviews and equality-proofing their pay systems.
Maggie Chapman.
The Cabinet Secretary for that response, the Deputy First Minister for that response. Pay discrimination appears to be endemic in local government. The GMB union has active equal pay cases in 6 local authorities, including Dundee. Job evaluation is an ongoing issue in Glasgow, and a local authority contracting company used by Dundee, Angus and Perth and Kinross councils uses discriminatory practices. Today is May Day, International Workers' Day. Will the Deputy First Minister agree to meet with the GMB union to discuss the issues their members are facing and to support the development of a strategy to deal with pay discrimination in local government?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, first of all, let me thank Maggie Chapman for raising what are important issues. She, of course, will be aware that as councils are independently accountable bodies and employers, it is their duties to ensure compliance with the Equality Act 2010. We recognise the need to move forward on these issues. Of course, our negotiation and ongoing dialogue with trade unions is important to us, but we have to ensure that where it is contractual and employment-related issues, that has to remain an issue between the trade unions and the respective employer local authorities in this case. We, of course, recognise the importance of local government funding within that context and them being able to take the steps that they need to resolve some of the equal pay claims. And with that in mind, of course, that's why the 2024-25 Scottish Budget provides record funding for local government of over £14 billion, a record real terms increase of 2.5%. But I would be happy to further discuss with Maggie Chapman the issues if she would like to do so.
Supplementary, Michael Mara.
Officer, and I welcome the response from the Deputy First Minister regarding the compliance on these issues. What would you say to the leader of Dundee City Council, who continually refuses to meet with the GMB union or, frankly, answer correspondence from parliamentarians on this exact issue around the pay dispute? And can I draw the Chamber's attention to my declaration of interest as a member of the GMB?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, first of all, let me say that I know the leader of Dundee City Council takes these matters very seriously indeed and values very much the relationship with the trade unions. I would just remind Michael Mara that, of course, in relation to one of the biggest equal pay claims in the city of Glasgow, it took a change of administration from Labour to the SNP to begin to resolve these matters. So there is no lack of willingness and desire to resolve equal pay claims on the part of the Scottish National Party, whether that's in local government or anywhere else.
Thank you. I would make a plea for succinct questions and answers because we've still got quite a number of questions to get through. Question number 3, Sue Webber.
Hopefully I'll help with that, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the reports that local government debt has now risen to 160% of its annual funding settlement.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
While there are no limits on the amount a Scottish local authority can borrow, local authorities are under a statutory duty to determine and keep under review the maximum amount which it can afford to allocate to capital expenditure, including associated borrowing levels. Local authorities must have regard to SIPFA Prudential Code, which requires borrowing to be affordable, prudent and sustainable. Regulations also require a local authority to set an authorised limit for external debt.
Sue Webber.
Thank you, Minister. Given the shocking rise of local government debt and the risk of this to spiral further, can you confirm what contingency plans the Scottish Government has made in the event of a local authority going bankrupt?
Minister.
I thank the member for her question. Obviously, it is not possible for the kind of cuts which have come to our capital budget from the UK Government and for there not to be an impact. on capital borrowing if we want to continue doing some of the services. But when we're talking about councils going bankrupt, there have been no councils in Scotland who have gone bankrupt, and the latest report suggested there were none likely to. That's a huge contrast to Conservative-controlled England, where there have been 12 Section 114 notices in 8 councils. And these are not just Labour councils, presiding officer. We've got Nottingham City Council twice, Croydon Borough Council, Slough Borough Council, Nottingham City Council, Croydon Borough Council again, Northumberland Council, Croydon Borough Council again, Thurrock Council, Woking Borough Council, Birmingham Council and most recently Nottingham City Council. So, presiding officer, this government will keep doing what we can to support and work with our local authorities. I think the UK government should start doing the same to their local authorities.
Supplementary, John Mason.
Thank you. I wonder if the Minister would say anything about the private finance initiative and the public-private partnerships which put local authorities under huge pressure and impacted their debt.
Minister.
John Mason makes a very strong point. PFI was an expensive Labour and Tory mistake that simply did not deliver best value for the people of Scotland. PFI PPP unitary payments place significant pressure on local authorities. Presiding officer, there are 38 local authority PFI contracts. Up to £7.25 billion in payments on these contracts have been made up to this year, with a further £8.15 billion in payments to be made over the coming year. That's £15.4 billion of payments for local authority contracts, with a capital value, presiding officer, of just £3.27 billion.
And supplementary, Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I recently attended an event hosted by COSLA and discussed priorities that were set out in their 5-year plan in 2022. This includes securing sustainable funding, delivering a just transition and supporting the most vulnerable in our communities. Given the financial pressure being faced by our Council, can the Minister advise what measures the Scottish Government is taking to ensure these goals are met?
Minister.
The member for his question, and this is certainly an area that the Scottish Government are working constructively with COSLA on. No one is coming here suggesting that there are not pressures on local government's finances, just the same as there are right across the public service. That's why this government took decisions to increase the amount of spending power the government had, and I would hope progressive colleagues across the Parliament would continue to support those kind of policies to make sure we can prioritise public services over the kind of tax cuts that the Conservative government.
Question number 4, Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the work of the Ferries Task Force with Orkney Islands Council, including when it expects new ferries to be procured.
Minister Jim Fairley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Deputy First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary for Transport met with the new Deputy Leader of Orkney Islands Council on the 18th of April, and they reiterated the Scottish Government's commitment to support the Council in their work to develop a robust business case for the ferry replacement, which can then inform the Council's decisions on their next steps. It was also confirmed in that meeting that the Scottish Government have maintained almost £16 million worth of support for the operation of Orkney's ferries in 24-25 in a very challenging financial context. And there was also that we're also continuing to provide additional island cost emergency funding to the Council this year as well.
Liam MacArthur.
Can I thank the Minister for that response? When the previous First Minister stood down last year, the work of the Ferries Task Force came to an abrupt halt for around 6 months. Given the urgent need to move ahead with procurement of new vessels to operate the lifeline routes in Orkney, can the Minister guarantee that the latest departure from Bute House won't result in the Ferries Task Force being stuck in dry dock again for the remainder of the year?
Minister.
I can absolutely confirm to the member that the work is progressing at pace, and if at such time he wants to come and have an update, a briefing with myself or with the Transport Secretary, I'd be more than happy to oblige.
Supplementary, Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The National Shipbuilding Strategy refresh in 2022 outlined a 30-year pipeline of all public sector vessel procurements and committed to having a minimum 10% weighting on social value for all new vessel competitions. Can the Minister confirm that in the case of this programme, will the Government adhere to the 10% minimum threshold on social value and perhaps even go further and be more ambitious as Maritime UK has called for?
Minister.
I have to say that's a question that the Transport Secretary will write to the member with an answer to.
Question number 5, Douglas Lumsden.
To ask the Scottish Government what the implications are for future tax revenue of reports that the economic recovery outlook for Scotland continues to lag behind the UK average.
Deputy First Minister.
Despite being tied to the failing UK economic model, the Scottish economy, far from lagging behind the UK, is one of the best performing parts of the UK. Scotland, unlike the UK, has avoided entering recession in 2023. Earnings in Scotland grew by 8% in 2023, faster than any other part of the UK, including London and the South East, and income tax revenues are growing faster in Scotland than the rest of the UK.
Douglas Lumsden.
The latest Scottish Government report shows that growth in Scotland's economy for 2025 is expected to be 1.1%, while in the rest of the UK, growth is expected to be nearly double that. So would the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that this failure by the Scottish Government will mean an even bigger black hole for our budget in future years? And what actions are the devolved government taking to have growth levels compatible with the rest of the UK?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I know that the Conservatives find it difficult to welcome any good news about the Scottish economy. In my initial remarks, I laid out some of the areas that the Scottish economy is outperforming the UK in terms of strong earnings growth, record income tax receipts. We are absolutely aware of the need for our economy to grow. Scotland's GDP, of course, per capita has grown faster than the UK's since 2007, and since 2007 productivity has grown at an annual average rate of 1% a year in Scotland, compared to the UK's 0.4% a year. And of course, inward investment projects in Scotland have grown quicker have grown by 3.3% compared to a 6.4% fall across the UK. We absolutely want to make sure that we have a growing economy and we have strength in many areas, not least in net zero. It's just a pity that the Conservatives continue to talk down the Scottish economy.
Question number 6, Jimmy Green.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what analysis it has undertaken of how income tax divergence has impacted or may impact private sector recruitment.
Minister Tom Arthur.
Our tax policies are grounded in evidence, and we regularly monitor data on the tax base throughout the year, as well as engaging with business organisations to understand the trading conditions they face. Latest data from HMRC show that the number of payrolled employees in Scotland has grown to a near record high, while separate HMRC research has recently shown that Scotland has attracted thousands of taxpayers from the rest of the UK since 2017-18. This is helping contribute to record income tax receipts, with Scottish income tax now forecast to raise around £18.8 billion in 2024-25.
Jamie Green.
Of course, the Minister is keen to quote figures which are 4 years out of date. Since then, of course, we've seen massive tax hikes in Scotland. He talks about evidence and data. Well, here's some evidence and data. The data says that if you earn £50,000 or more in Scotland, you will pay 20% more tax than any other part of the UK. It's not a sustainable position that is not affecting the private sector's ability to recruit. Every commentator says it. The IOD, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, the Scottish Financial Enterprise, even the Scottish Fiscal Commission itself is warning of tax divergence and its effect on recruitment. So will the Minister not accept that business is telling us and telling the Government that increased tax levels in Scotland are hammering their ability to recruit well-paid jobs here in Scotland?
Minister.
Well, let me start with a point of consensus. I think it's exceptionally important to engage with business, to work with business constructively in our shared endeavour for economic growth. But let me just say where I take a slightly different view. The most recent data that we have is for 21-22, and that shows net positive migration to Scotland across all income tax bands. That is the most recent data that we have to make an assumption on. The second point I would make to the member is this. It is important to look holistically in the round. For example, the significant divergence in average property prices in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, the significant difference in average council tax compared to the rest of the UK. And if a young professional is so fortunate to be in a position where they are earning £50,000 a year and they have been through an undergraduate university course in Scotland, unlike their counterparts in England, they're not going to be carrying the better part of 30 grand's worth of tuition fee debt. So across a range of measures, we use our progressive income tax policies in Scotland to deliver not only a competitive environment, but the best social contract on offer anywhere in these islands.
And a brief supplementary, Jackie Dunbar.
Opposition members often highlight concerns about potential impacts of Scotland's progressive tax system. Can the Minister say any more about what assessment the Scottish Government has made of the recent HMRC research, which indicates that thousands more taxpayers moved to Scotland than left each year in the period after Scottish income tax was introduced?
Minister.
The reality is, ever since income tax was first devolved, opposition parties have claimed that even the slightest policy divergence would lead to an exodus from Scotland. Recent HMRC research dispels that. Growing numbers of taxpayers are leaving the rest of the UK for Scotland, with net inflows averaging 4,200 each year between 2017-18 and 21-22. In the last available year of data, taxable income grew by around £200 million due to this movement of taxpayers. I'll leave it to others in this Parliament to explain how slashing taxes and running down public services would make Scotland a more attractive place to live.
Question number 7, Carol Mockin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on whether it has funded local government adequately to deliver the services that it is responsible for.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thank the member for her question. The Scottish Government recognises the challenging financial circumstances that local authorities and indeed the entire public sector are currently facing. These challenges were considered and reflected in the Local Government Finance Settlement, which provides local authorities with record funding of over £14 billion in 2024-25, a real terms increase of 2.55% compared with the previous year. It is then the responsibility of individual local authorities to manage their own budgets and to allocate the total financial resource available to them on the basis of local needs and priorities.
Carol Mockin.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Councils and residents in my region of South Scotland and beyond are feeling the true impact of successive SNP budgets, of course backed up by the Greens, that have taken the axe to council funding and services. Does the Minister understand the level of cuts in local authorities imposed by his government to the poorest communities in Scotland? And is it not the case that Scotland is now suffering from two out-of-touch, out-of-road governments, and they would be far better off without them?
Minister.
No, I don't agree. We just heard about the levels of local authorities having to serve Section 114 notices in the rest of the UK, where the Scottish National Party is not in government. But let me just talk about the rises that have come to the members' South of Scotland region. Dumfries and Galloway, 5.7% increase compared to 23-24. East Ayrshire, 5.2%. East Lothian, 8.5% compared to 23-24. I see time is running. Scottish Borders, 6.2% increase, Presiding Officer. South Ayrshire Council, 6.7% increase compared to the 23-24 budget. And Midlothian Council, 7.6% increase compared to the 23-24 budget. We all recognise these are challenging times for everyone in public service, but it's absolutely clear that this Scottish Government has prioritised the local services and local government to the best of our ability.
I have two requests for supplementaries. I intend to take both members, but they will need to be brief. Liz Smith.
The Scottish Government made a commitment last year via the Verity House Agreement that it would introduce multi-year funding for council budgets, and Shirley-Ann Somerville made that commitment for the voluntary sector in November. Can I ask again when that's going to happen?
Minister.
The member does not find any division across the chamber, I don't think, about the importance of multi-year budgeting, but it is absolutely impossible with the volatility of the current system, where the UK budget comes so late in the year for us and comes with no certainty, no multi-year aspect to that, for us to do that. But it's absolutely something that this government would want to take forward, but it's something we need to take forward in partnership with the local government and, of course, in partnership with the UK government.
And brief supplementary, Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. With the Scottish Government providing a record funding of over £14 billion local authorities, has just been said, can the Cabinet Secretary provide any update regarding the work underway to empower local government, including a new fiscal framework?
Minister.
Thank you, thank the member for the question. Work on the fiscal framework is really important to the Scottish Government in terms of their collaboration with COSLA. It's something that is being taken forward with a close working with COSLA to agree a local framework. We published an update just last December, and we would be working for the fiscal framework, subject to those collaborations, to be in place in advance of the 25-26 Scottish budget.
And question number 8, Ash Regan.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it still plans to deliver the shared policy programme contained within the Butte House Agreement, in light of reports that many of its policies have been discarded.
Deputy First Minister.
The Butte House Agreement played a central role in our aim of building a greener, fairer and independent Scotland. It made possible a number of achievements, including delivering a progressive budget that prioritised the NHS and public services over tax cuts, free bus travel for under-22s, bringing ScotRail into public ownership and committing the first £75 million of the 10-year Just Transition Fund for the North East Dunmurray. But for the reasons set out by the First Minister last Thursday, the First Minister took the decision to end the Butte House Agreement. Any policy decisions will be notified to Parliament in the normal manner.
Ash Regan.
What is the point of the First Minister dramatically chucking the Greens out of the front door, only for the next one to sneak them in round the back?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, this government will get on with governing as a minority government, and of course in doing so we will reach out to those who share our progressive values, who want to work with us in a constructive manner, and that will be the case for the opposition parties across the whole of this Parliament. The question for them is, can they rise to the occasion?
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. That concludes portfolio questions on finance, Deputy First Minister responsibilities and parliamentary business. There will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business. Thank you.
Thank you. The next item of business. The next item of business is a debate on motion 13005 in the name of Anna Sarwar on motion of no confidence, and I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on Anna Sarwar to speak to and move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by recognising the significant announcement Humza Yousaf made this week that he was resigning as First Minister. While he and I have significant political disagreements, I think it's important to take a moment to thank him for his public service, which has included 12 years as a Minister, and I wish him and his family the very best for the future. But for me and Scottish Labour, this has never been about one person. It is also not just about the past 17 years of SNP failure, but even more significantly, it is about the present and the future. Now more than ever, our country needs credible and effective leadership and stable and competent government to take on the twin crises facing our nation, an economic crisis and an NHS crisis. And I have no confidence in the SNP's ability to deliver that, and that is why I am bringing this motion to Parliament today. And this motion of no confidence in this SNP government is based on two principal arguments. First, it is now clear that the SNP as a political party are so chaotic, divided and dysfunctional that it can't deliver competent government and is failing Scots every single day. And I don't believe that changes if they purely change the face at the top. Let's look at the two candidates being suggested, Kate Forbes and John Swinney. There are already SNP ministers briefing journalists that if Kate Forbes was to become leader, they would actively look to stop her being able to form a government, and that would mean even more chaos. And John Swinney, the man who has been at the heart of the SNP government for the last 17 years, the heart of the SNP leadership for the last 40 years, the finance secretary that broke the public finances, and the worst education secretary in the history of the Scottish Parliament. Hardly the competence or the change our country needs. And second, it is about the democratic deficit. It would be untenable for the SNP to impose yet another unelected First Minister on our country, especially in these circumstances. And let me remind the Chamber what Nicola Sturgeon said when Rishi Sunak replaced Liz Truss as Prime Minister. She said we couldn't have a revolving door at Downing Street, that the office of Prime Minister was not the plaything of one political party, and that there would be a democratic outrage if it didn't go to an election and for the people to decide. If that's the principle the SNP rightly apply to Westminster and the UK, why do they now hold Scotland and this Parliament to a lower standard? Now, I know SNP members will point to Vaughan Gething as First Minister in Wales or other examples, but it's important to recognise the difference. Leaders stating that they would not complete full terms or leaving due to deeply personal circumstances and having a managed and orderly transition is very different from two leaders leaving in controversy and chaos. Because for the second time in as many years, we have scandal, incompetence and political self-interest, with the SNP putting party before country and imposing their choice on the people of Scotland. Because it should be for the people to decide who leads our country, not a backroom deal, not a stage-managed coronation or a small group of SNP members. And, Presiding Officer, I think the similarities now between the UK Conservative Government and the SNP Scottish Government are now so clear to see. Two political parties, both chaotic, divided, dysfunctional, unleadable, ungovernable, incompetent, distracted by internal wars, distant from the people's priorities and unable to fix the mess of their own making. Both looking to pitch community against community, both entrenched in the politics of division, and both unable to meet the ambitions, hopes and aspirations of the people. That's why our country is crying out for change. Yes, they want rid of this rotten Tory government across the UK, but they also want to move on from this dysfunctional and incompetent SNP government here in Scotland. That's why we need an election, so the people can decide. And it's getting clearer and clearer by the day that only Labour can deliver the change Scotland needs. And I can hear from SNP members that they don't agree, but it's because it's them that have stopped listening to the Scottish people. The people struggling in a cost of living crisis who need a government on their side, focused on jobs and lowering bills. The people languishing on NHS waiting lists who need a government that will renew and reform our NHS. The people stuck in temporary accommodation with record levels of homelessness who need a government focused on building new homes. The people who worry about their children's future, who need a government to raise education standards and bring opportunities to every community. The people who can see the huge potential of Scotland being squandered by two incompetent governments and who need a government that actually believes in economic growth and is willing to work with business. It is now clearer than it's ever been that it's time for the people of Scotland to have their say. It's time to elect a government capable of delivering on the ambitions and hopes of every person in our great country. And that's why, Presiding Officer, I have no confidence in this SNP government. I have no confidence that they can deliver the stability and competence we need. That's why it's time for change, and I move the motion in my name.
Thank you. I now call the First Minister. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As this, of course, is my first opportunity to do so since my announcement on Monday, can I begin by putting on record my thanks to you, Presiding Officer, for the job that you have done throughout my tenure overseeing proceedings in this chamber. That said, Presiding Officer, I'm afraid that with this First Minister shortly leaving government, you may have one more raucous backbencher to have to manage. But can I also thank Anas Sarwar at the beginning of his remarks for his kind remarks. Can I thank actually everybody across the chamber, many who have sent me kind messages over the last 24 and 48 hours. I have to say, getting so many kind messages from the opposition has unnerved me ever so slightly. Nonetheless, let me concentrate on Anas Sarwar's remarks. He did start his speech by saying, for Anas Sarwar, this is not personal, and then launched an attack on John Swinney and Kate Forbes. Yeah. Even by Anas Sarwar standards, that is the fastest Labour U-turn, Presiding Officer, I think I have ever seen. And Anas Sarwar also, throughout his speech, spoke about members of this Parliament being unelected. Let's be absolutely clear here. Every single member of this Scottish Parliament, SNP, Labour, Liberal Democrat, Conservatives, Greens, Alba, they are all elected. Let's not cast any doubt upon that. When it comes to attacking my colleagues John Swinney and of course Kate Forbes, let me remind Anas Sarwar that, of course, when they put themselves up for the vote, when they put themselves up to the people's verdict in the constituencies that they stood for, they won, unlike Anas Sarwar, Presiding Officer. Yep. So let's not talk about unelected versus elected. Everybody here is elected. Well, we know, of course, Presiding Officer, that the motion of no confidence today will be defeated. It does give me the opportunity to talk up our record and this government's considerable achievements, but also point out Labour's lack of substance, but also hypocrisy as well. And as I've found out, Presiding Officer, only too well in the last few days, politics is definitely about the choices we choose to make. And as a government, I am exceptionally proud of our choices. Where the Westminster Consensus, Labour and Tories, have chosen Brexit, Scotland chose to remain in the EU. Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer both chose to retain the two-child limit and the rape clause. The SNP government opposes it. Labour chooses to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses, but not lift the cap on child benefits. The SNP choose differently. And Sir Keir Starmer, who of course Anas Sarwar answers to, chooses to commit to Tory spending and tax plans. These plans mean the wealthy will benefit from a tax cut, while the NHS and other public services get slashed to the bone. We choose progressive taxation to increase investment in the NHS and public services. We choose to launch a 10-year Just Transition Fund to support Scotland's drive to net zero, where, of course, Labour choose to ditch their £28 billion green energy pledge. And where Keir Starmer refused for months to call for an immediate ceasefire, even failing to condemn the collective punishment of the people of Gaza, I and the government I lead chose to be a voice for peace and humanity in the world. So yes, Presiding Officer, those are just some of the choices I and those in the seats behind me are so proud of. And what of the result of those choices? Attainment in Scotland at a record high. Record numbers of students from deprived areas entering our university. This year, this government's actions are lifting an estimated 100,000 children out of poverty. We continue to be the top destination for foreign investment outside of London. More people are coming to Scotland from the rest of the UK than leaving, and yet no one in the opposition thinks about pausing for a second to ask why. Could it have something to do with the very choices this SNP government have made? Choices like the baby box, expanded childcare, free university education, free prescriptions, free nursing and personal care, free school meals, no bridge tolls, no hospital car parking charges, free bus travel for under 22s, those with a disability, those over 60, the game-changing Scottish Child Payment, and so much more. All because of the choices we have made, all because of our record. And all of that, Presiding Officer, in the face of 14 years of Tory austerity, a Brexit we didn't vote for, and a Westminster cost of living crisis we didn't create, but our people are suffering as a result of. So yes, I am proud of the record of the government that I have the honour of leading, at least for a little while longer. So, Presiding Officer, as I reflect on my time as First Minister coming to an end, I will remind the Chamber what I said when I first became First Minister. I promised my door would always be open. I promised that I would listen to good ideas that came from across the parliamentary chamber. And I have to say, in that whole time, the 13 months that I've been blessed, lucky to be First Minister, I haven't heard a single positive idea from Anna Sarwar or the Labour idea. That's clear from this afternoon's debate. What I have heard, however, is the deafening sound of principle after principle being thrown out of Anna Sarwar's window. You turning on the two-child cap, you turning on the devolution of employment law, you turning on the devolution of drug law, you turning on his support for WASPy women. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, we on the SNP benches here will leave Labour to justify all of that if they can. We will never do anything other than stand by our values, stand by Scotland's values. The true vote of no confidence that the people of Scotland really need and they deserve is a vote of no confidence in this failing, miserable union that is holding Scotland back and inflicting damage on the people and the economy of this country. The cosy Westminster Alliance represented here today are terrified of such a vote. Why? Because they know what the result will be. So I urge the Chamber, Presiding Officer, to reject this motion and let's start focusing on the real priorities of the people of Scotland.
Thank you. Thank you. I now call on Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And on a personal level, can I wish Humza Yousaf well as he prepares to leave office? I think it's been clear that I have disagreed with many of the policies he has introduced in his time, but he has served our country as First Minister for a year and in government for over a decade. And it's also been very clear during his time in office, and particularly during his resignation statement on Monday, that family is important to him. It is integral to everything he does. And while he will have reflections and I'm sure regrets over the coming months and years, I know he will take comfort in being able to spend more time with the family he cherishes, and one that is going to get bigger in a few months' time. So we wish him well for that as well. But, Presiding Officer, Scottish Conservatives will vote in favour of the motion today. We want to see the SNP government removed and will look to use every opportunity to do so. Yet Labour have failed to build the majority they need in this Parliament to achieve that. In contrast, my party's vote of no confidence in Humza Yousaf was successful. Humza Yousaf has announced he is resigning from the office of First Minister. And it was the Scottish Conservatives who built a parliamentary majority to force him out. That's what strong opposition can deliver, and that is just the first step. We want to get rid of this entire distracted, divided SNP government. And the upcoming general election will have a chance to deliver another blow to them. In seats across Scotland, it's only the Scottish Conservatives who can get rid of the SNP, just like we're getting rid of Humza Yousaf, and get the focus back onto the priorities of people right across this country. But as we look ahead to the interim period, where we are now, the would-be successors to Humza Yousaf are hardly rushing out the blocks to seize that poison chalice to lead the SNP. But two names are being mentioned to take over. And it's interesting, both are creeping a little further to the front bench and are ideally placed for us today, one behind the other, so I'm sure the cameras will get a great shot of them. But it looks as though Nicola Sturgeon's Health Secretary will either be replaced by Nicola Sturgeon's deputy or Nicola Sturgeon's Finance Secretary. And what does this say about the current Scottish Government? Each of the individuals on the front bench today, handpicked by Humza Yousaf to run departments of this Government, have ruled themselves out. They don't want to do it. Never mind the opposition having no confidence in this Government, it seems none of the Government ministers have confidence in themselves. But the frontrunners, though, represent continuity. Kate Forbes ran Scotland's economy when it lagged behind the rest of the United Kingdom. Her budgets put up taxes on Scottish workers and failed to pass on vital relief to Scottish businesses. And Kate Forbes has said she wants to hold an independence referendum within 3 months of a general election. She's an even more radical nationalist than Humza Yousaf and Nicola Sturgeon. Then, presiding officer, there's Honest John. If he's successful, Scotland faces
Mr Ross, we do not use nicknames in the chamber.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was on accuracy, because it would be not so honest, John, with some of the things we've heard recently.
Mr Ross, I would ask you to apologise and then continue.
But then there's...
Mr Ross, if you might apologise and then continue.
Yes. Then there's John Swinney.
Sorry, Mr Ross, sorry. You may not be able to hear me. I'd be grateful if you would apologise for that and then continue.
I will apologise. I'm very sorry for any hurt caused. But if John Swinney is successful, we face the dreadful prospect of Nicola Sturgeon's prodigy being replaced by Nicola Sturgeon's right-hand man. Of going from the man who ruined Scotland's NHS to the man who ruined Scotland's education system. Of going from one failed leader to a leader who has already failed. Whichever nationalist wins, we already know they'll obsess about independence. We will remain the highest tax part of the United Kingdom for workers and businesses. 1 in 7 Scots will remain on an NHS waiting list. Scottish education will continue to fall down international rankings. Dualling key roads like the A9 and the A96 will continue to be delayed. Police numbers will continue to drop and dangerous criminals will be let off with reduced sentences. Whether we have a bitter battle or a cosy coronation to elect the next leader of the SNP, they will continue campaigning for independence, and the Scottish people will continue to be failed by them.
Thank you. I now call on Patrick Harvie.
As I've already said to the First Minister personally, the events of the last week are a source of regret, but certainly not of hostility or ill will at a personal level. And it is appropriate today to acknowledge the human impact of political life. For Humza Yousaf, that impact was shown most clearly in a moment of immense dignity, when at a time when global political events were impacting directly on his own family. Humza Yousaf rightly gained huge respect for speaking out for, and in many cases humanising, the people of Gaza, humanising the victims of collective punishment in a way that no other national leader I can think of was able to do. For this and for a great deal more, Humza Yousaf is due respect and thanks. And all of our thanks for his service to the country. Now, others may have a very long list of grievances. They may have an implacable hostility to everything the First Minister or the SNP or the Butte House Agreement represents. But for the Greens, the reason we were unable to have confidence in the First Minister personally was his decision to needlessly end the progressive, pro-independence majority government. It is to his credit that he's taken personal responsibility and announced his resignation. I don't celebrate that in any way, but I do believe it was necessary. And in the light of that decision, a vote of no confidence in the First Minister personally would have been performative and petty, and I welcome the fact that it's been withdrawn. But a vote of no confidence in the Scottish Government as a whole, this proposal betrays the true motives of others. Chaos for the sake of chaos. Let's just consider what would happen if it passed. let's just consider what would happen if it passed. A month to seek another government, then an election around the time that voters around the country were heading off on their summer holidays, a new government formed perhaps by August, leaving, if members will permit another viewpoint to be heard, leaving just a little more than a year and a half until the legally required dissolution for the 2026 election. And in that time, what would happen to the legislation that's urgently needed? A housing bill has just been introduced with measures on homelessness prevention and long-term rent controls. We have a need for a climate reset following the admission that Scotland is years behind where we should be on emission cuts. Or one of the few areas of climate policy that's been praised in the last couple of years, the Heat and Buildings programme, which needs legislation soon if it's going to be completed in time to accelerate the emission cuts from a previously neglected sector. All of this and much, much more would be delayed, and then after less than 2 years, yet another government, potentially with a different policy agenda altogether. Presiding Officer, fixed-term parliaments are intended to give stability, and they have done so in contrast with more than a decade of chaos in Westminster politics. It should be clear to everyone that both Labour and the Conservatives don't actually want stable self-government for Scotland. Greens do. Now, we already had the best option, a stable, progressive, pro-independence majority government, and I regret that it hasn't been allowed to continue. The government will no longer be a majority government. But minority government can work. It's happened before, and it can happen again. It's not beyond the ability of any political party in this chamber to work constructively in that context if they choose to. But a minority government must reach out and bring together a majority in Parliament. And for that to happen, it will need to remain a progressive government. A reset on climate, an acceleration of emission cuts, not defeatism. A bold commitment to equality, not a shabby compromise with a nasty, divisive culture war mentality that we see from elsewhere. And continued redistribution, which will be all the more important if an incoming UK Labour government carries out its threat to stick to Tory fiscal rules, meaning even more austerity. That's the progressive agenda, which is still capable of providing stable government for Scotland, instead of the chaos that the Labour motion seeks.
Thank you. And I now call on Willie Rennie.
Politics can be ugly, and never more so than the last week. But I have to pay great tribute to the First Minister, for I thought in a moment of great stress that he made a speech of great dignity and grace. It was a resignation speech, I think, if we were all in those situations, that we would want to make, and I think it's a great tribute to him. And personally, I've always found him a very warm and generous individual with a great smile and a sense of humour. And I do congratulate him and Nadia for the soon-to-be parents again. If he thought he was going to escape the sleepless nights, I think they're about to come back with a vengeance. But it does say something that the leadership of the Conservative Party is more stable than the leadership of the SNP. Now, I'm old enough to remember when Nicola Sturgeon was First Minister, and it's good to see her back in her place this afternoon. And I don't know whether she would want to make an intervention on the contribution that she made before, when she said the governance of any country cannot simply be a revolving door, that one party gets to pick time and time again who occupies the highest office in the land. Now, I don't know if she resiles from those remarks, but I'm sure the Chamber this afternoon would welcome her updated commentary on whether there should be an election now, because that's something that I think is worth considering, and that's why we'll support the motion of no confidence this afternoon. I notice she's not rising to her feet. I suspect she's ducking this one quite smartly. But this government is fond, and this is my second reason for supporting the vote this afternoon. This government is fond of saying that it's the best in the UK. Now, the best, I don't think, is how you could judge the view of the single mother in my constituency who went without food in order to pay for her private dental bills because she couldn't get an NHS dentist. Or the elderly man I met who was wincing with pain because his operation had been delayed once again for his hip operation, or the classroom assistant who had a broken wrist right in front of me because she had a violent incident with a pupil in a class, or the islanders who are desperately waiting for a reliable ferry service. They're not saying that this is the best, but this government is riddled with complacency. It believes that somehow, because we're marginally better on some occasions than the Conservative government, that somehow we should be grateful for the performance of this government. And I think that is the second reason why we need a renewed mandate for this Parliament, and that's why we should have an election. Now, Jamie Hepburn, I'm a big fan of Jamie Hepburn, and many people have heard me talk about Jamie Hepburn before. He toils away on his own in private with his civil servants, crafting document after document that absolutely nobody reads, but nevertheless, we've got to give him credit for that. Now, I want to release Jamie Hepburn for the endless torture of this responsibility. For that reason alone, I'm sure everybody would agree that we should have an election. But I never thought I would ever say the words that I agree with Ash Regan. But her comments earlier on, where she said, we chucked the Greens out the front door to sneak them in the back door, is the fundamental problem with this government. Because either it heals the rift with the Green Party, or it heals the rift with the public. And it can't do both. That was Humza Yousaf's view last week, that the Butte House agreement couldn't continue, that it was dragging down the SNP, so therefore we needed to have that break. Now, but they need the majority, and that's why they need the Greens. So it's not possible to have a mandate in this Parliament, and therefore it needs to be renewed. And for all of those reasons, for the revolving door, for the belief that it's the best, for the case of Jamie Hepburn, if nothing else, but also to heal the rift, we need to have an election.
Thank you, and I call on Jackie Baillie to wind up.
Presiding officer, I used to think that there really isn't anything that was new in politics, but I have to say that the current period of chaotic government is exceptional, whether it's at Westminster or indeed at Holyrood. We've had a ringside seat observing the trauma experienced by the current UK government. First it was Boris Johnson, but Partygate was his undoing. Then we had Liz Truss for all of 50 days, and that resulted in interest rates rising and mortgages spiralling out of control. And now, of course, we have Rishi Sunak presiding over the country's continuing decline. The last two, of course, were appointed by the Tory party and were not elected by the country. And the parallels with the current SNP government are self-evident. With the SNP, we are about to have a third leader in as many years. The last two elected by their party and not by our country. And I think the people of Scotland deserve to be heard. And I'm not alone in that thinking. Here's what others had to say when Rishi Sunak was elected. It shouldn't just be down to Tory MPs and Tory members to pick the next Prime Minister. Ian Blackford, 22nd of October 2022. Then we have this comment. He should call an early general election. He's the second person in a row to be appointed as Prime Minister by the Tories, not elected by the population. The idea that he can go for 2 years before seeking or winning a democratic mandate, I think, is just unthinkable. Nicola Sturgeon, 24th of October 2022. So, it's unthinkable. Is Nicola Sturgeon now wrong? So given that we face exactly the same situation in Scotland, the SNP should at least be consistent and agree that democracy demands a Holyrood election. But what have they got to fear? Are they worried about the verdict of the people of Scotland? Their verdict on 1 in 6 people on NHS waiting lists. Their verdict, not one of the SNP's targets to end long waits have been met. A 10% increase in drug deaths, 10,000 people waiting on social care assessments and support, an economy that is weak, struggling to gain traction, and growth is stagnant. Funding for colleges and universities slashed, affecting the very future of our young people. Homelessness applications increasing, rough sleeping back on our streets, and a record high for the number of households, particularly with children, in temporary accommodation. A housing emergency, presiding officer, but the SNP slashed the housing budget by £190 million. And of course, climate targets weakened and scrapped. This is a record of shame. It's a record of failure. People are tired of two governments that are failing them. They want change. They want a government focused on their priorities, on the NHS, on the economy, on education. But instead, we will have another SNP contest for the next First Minister. More division, more acrimony, more anonymous briefings from Cabinet Secretaries, but zero focus on the things that matter to the people of Scotland. It's time for a Holyrood election. It's time for change.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on motion of no confidence. We'll now move to the question on the motion. And the question is that motion 13005 in the name of Anna Sarwar on motion of no confidence be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system. Agreed, and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. Point of order, Jenny Gilruth.
Would have voted no.
I can confirm, Ms Gilruth, your vote was recorded. Thank you. The result of the vote on motion 13005 in the name of Anna Sarwar is yes 58, no 70. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore not agreed. There will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business.
Okay, the next item of business is debate on motion 13041 in the name of Hamza Youssef on WASPI Women Against State Pension Inequality. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And I call on Hamza Youssef to speak to and move the motion. First Minister, around 11 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the motion in my name. Presiding Officer, I will undoubtedly miss being in government. It has been my life for the last almost 12 years. However, there will, of course, be some silver linings. The first, of course, the time I will be able to spend with my family, though I must confess that my 15-year-old daughter Maya didn't look overly excited by that prospect. The second is that I will be able to dedicate more time to my constituents and my constituency. And one part of my constituency that I share, actually, with Nicola Sturgeon is Govan. And it is within Govan that the Mary Barber statue is located. That monument was a very fitting end point to a march and rally organised by the WASPI Women in 2019 that I had the pleasure of attending alongside my daughter Maya. And the reason why I took Maya to that march and rally was not just to tell her about the injustices that have been done to the WASPI Women, but to show her the hundreds and the thousands of women who are standing up not just for their rights, but for the rights of all women and girls, regardless of their age. You see, Presiding Officer, the injustice done to the WASPI women is undoubtedly a gender injustice. There's no doubt in my mind, none whatsoever, that if men had been treated in this way, if they'd had their hard-earned money taken away from them with little or no choice, no notice, then not only would there be an outrage, but crucially, I suspect the Westminster establishment would have found a solution. For years, the pleas of the WASPI women have fallen on the deaf ears in the corridors of Whitehall. They've been ignored by the UK government, ignored by ministers, ignored by the Treasury, and virtually every member and department of the UK government. Any other campaign, any other campaigners might have simply run out of steam, given up due to the intransigence of the political establishment in Westminster, but not the WASPI women. A number of the incredible women are in the public gallery today. You can see them just behind me. And they should be, Presiding Officer, commended and applauding for not taking no for an answer. So my thank you to the WASPI women for their tireless effort. They have, Presiding Officer, pursued every avenue possible to demand their rights. And I'm pleased that the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman has agreed that the WASPI women have been wronged and deserve justice. Let me be clear, the Scottish Government doesn't just support the WASPI women's right to justice. That, of course, we do. We support their calls for compensation too. The PHSO report, finally published on the 21st of March, after far too long a wait, criticises the handling of the DWP's communication of the equalisation of the state pension age for men and women, and calls for the women impacted by those failings to be compensated to the value of between £1,000 and £2,950. That's level 4 of the 6 levels of compensation available to them. But this government, the Scottish Government, recognises the WASPI campaign's call for the highest level of £10,000 or more to properly reflect the harm caused to those women over time. So the Scottish Government will do all we can to demand that Westminster does the right thing and fully compensate the women it has wronged. Presiding Officer, it's deeply disappointing. I've yet to receive a response to my letter that was sent both to the Prime Minister but also to Sir Keir Starmer, stating that the current, or indeed any future UK Government, must take action immediately to compensate the women impacted. I look forward to this chamber hopefully uniting today in agreement on righting an historic injustice. I note all leaders in this Parliament have pledged their support to the WASPI campaign and committed to their compensation. So while the Labour and Conservatives' recent commitments to the triple lock are critical, it is and would be a complete abandonment of the WASPI women that neither Rishi Sunak nor Keir Starmer pledged to deliver compensation to the women who have been affected. And while, in some respects, quite frankly, Presiding Officer, I would expect the Conservatives to shirk their responsibilities, for Labour to do the same is unforgivable. Labour politicians have taken great delight in turning up to photo calls with the WASPI women, wearing the purple sashes, promising to stand in solidarity with the women impacted. But it's not pictures, it's not warm words the WASPI women want. It is justice and it is compensation. Yeah. If Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, the woman who is likely to be the next Chancellor of the UK, continue to turn their backs on the WASPI women by refusing to commit to compensation, it would be an absolute betrayal for which they should never be forgiven. The SNP-led Scottish Government has always supported the WASPI campaign, and we will always seek to do so. I was delighted to attend the recent WASPI gathering on the 18th of April in Parliament and talk to the WASPI campaigner, something I just had the pleasure of doing before this debate too. Each of the women there has a story. Women who wanted to spend this chapter of their lives free of any financial worries. To Anne, to Katy, to Rosie, and the many other WASPI women who have had the privilege of meeting, your tireless campaigning has inspired me, most certainly, but politicians from right across the spectrum. And let me be very clear. On reaching this important milestone in your journey for justice, my colleagues and I, this government, will stand shoulder to shoulder with you until compensation has been paid in full. We also support SNP MP Alan Brown's bill currently making its way through the UK Parliament, calling for the UK Government to compensate women born in the 1950s. I hope Tory and Labour politicians here who will stand up shortly and tell WASPI women that they support their campaign will put their money where their mouth is. That they will use any influence they have, regardless of how small it may be, in their own parties and demand that their leaders in London do the right thing and compensate the WASPI women in full. No more excuses about how tight money is. We know how constrained the finances are. We know that. But this is about priorities, and the PHSO report makes it clear, and let me quote from them directly. Finite resources should not be used as an excuse for failing to provide a fair remedy. We agree. Each day that passes without justice, the financial harm done to the women impacted increases. And of course, with the passage of time, more and more women affected will of course not live to see justice. The WASPI website has two counters on their homepage, one that keeps a tally of the number of WASPI women who have died and not received justice or compensation, and the other counter shows the total amount that the Treasury has saved through the disgraceful actions of the Westminster Government. This morning, those counters showed that 277,389 women have died without being given compensation, and that the Treasury has disgracefully benefited to the tune of £4 billion. In Scotland alone, 336,000 women have been affected. Women who are owed between £300 million and £1 billion by the UK Government just for the compensation recommended by the PHSO. That would be even more, of course, compensation if it reflected the WASPI campaign's own assessment of the harm that has been done. A survey of 8,000 WASPI women that was carried out in autumn of last year found that 70% of WASPI women had reduced their weekly spending and had cut their food shops in the past 6 months. So the UK Government needs to step up. It needs to take responsibility for their failure to properly communicate the changes that have so adversely impacted these women. And if this uncaring, uncompassionate UK Government isn't willing to do the right thing, then a potential future Labour Government must stop the dithering, must stop the delay and commit explicitly to full compensation for the WASPI women, and they should do so now, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, as I stated at the outset, this is a monumental failing of the UK Government's own making. WASPI women maintain that they don't argue against equalisation in principle. However, the UK Government's approach to equalisation of state pension age was badly communicated from the beginning. It led to millions of women across the UK being unfairly penalised. As I highlighted earlier, I have written to the Prime Minister and to the Leader of the Opposition regarding the issue, and I also provided a copy of a letter from Anne Potter, Coordinator of WASPI Glasgow, Lanarkshire, Dunbartonshire and Renfrewshire, Anne, who is known to many across this chamber. In that letter, Anne references the historic injustice that the millions of women and their families across the UK have faced throughout the WASPI scandal. But more pertinently, she makes the point that this can be overcome by politicians doing the right thing and working together. If nothing else, we owe it, all of us, to those who have already passed away without even receiving so much as an apology, let alone justice, let alone the compensation they deserve. So let the voices in this chamber unite. Let them be unequivocal in their cry. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. The UK Government, current or future, must deliver fair and full compensation to all the women who've been impacted. And I can give WASPI women a personal promise. Be it from the front benches or indeed the back benches, they will always have my unwavering support and admiration. Thank you to all of the incredible, unrelenting WASPI women for not just fighting for yourselves, but thank you for fighting for my daughters too. And it is with great pride, Presiding Officer, that I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. Just to advise the Chamber, we have absolutely no time in hand this afternoon, so speeches will need to adhere to the time limits. And with that, I now call Douglas Ross to speak to and move Amendment 13041.2. Mr Ross, up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And the First Minister began with reflections of a constituency case and a constituency campaign, and I want to do the same. I want to put on record in this Parliament my thanks and pay tribute to Sheila Forbes from Lossiemouth, who has been spearheading the campaign for WASPI women in Lossie, in Murray and in many parts of Scotland for many years. Her tireless efforts deserve recognition, and indeed when I had a surgery just a few weeks ago in Lossie and an issue came up about WASPI women in which I wrote to the Department for Work and Pensions, Sheila's name was mentioned, because throughout some of the difficult times for the WASPI campaign in itself and some divisions within it, Sheila remained resolute to stand up for the women in Murray and wider communities who have been affected by this, continue to be affected by this, and indeed their friends and family, because as the First Minister has said, people who started out on this journey are no longer with us, and the campaign for justice for WASPI women is not just for those who remain campaigning, and I welcome the campaigners here to the gallery today, but those who fought this battle but sadly did not see justice. Can I then come to the motion we have in front of us today and my amendment? The motion was lodged yesterday. This was a debate that got introduced yesterday. Therefore, it was after the First Minister wrote to party leaders to speak about the new approach we have to take, and indeed after the speeches he made at the weekend. So I hope on reflection he might look at the amendment that I put in and see nothing he can disagree with, and that's certainly been my intention. I think what I'm trying to do here is, in this new era of minority government, there is an opportunity for this Parliament to debate I will give way if I can finish this point, to debate these important issues, to work across the parties, to maybe have a discussion about some of the motions we are putting in and some of the outcomes we can have as a Parliament. And maybe throughout this debate, the First Minister might reflect on the contributions made and the wording of my amendment, and consider actually accepting the amendment, which particularly focuses on the PHSO report. And I think it's crucial. There are issues here that look at the PHSO report and the wider campaign, but we can have a very strong voice in this Parliament today about the recommendations, including compensation for women affected by the changes and the maladministration that has clearly been identified in this report, while also considering the wider challenges faced with the bigger campaign. It has taken 5 years for the PHSO to conclude its report. That is a huge amount of work, and I want to see those recommendations taken on board, listened to and acted upon by the UK Government. And I think we can send a united voice from this Parliament on that issue, and I will give way briefly to the First Minister.
First Minister.
I do thank Douglas Ross for taking an intervention. What I would say to Douglas Ross is that it is, of course, important for us to work collaboratively together. That also does mean being really upfront and honest with the campaigners and the public more generally. So can I just get this on the record and understand this from Douglas Ross, because I have no doubt he's read the PHS report in detail. Does he believe that the current UK Government should be paying compensation to the women, the WASPI women who have been affected? Yes or no?
Douglas Ross.
Yes. Yes, I do. And that's what I've said. In fact, my amendment states that the UK Government should urgently address and respond to the recommendations of this report. And in fact, my amendment says, including the recommendation to pay compensation to those affected. The First Minister asked me a yes or no question, and the answer is yes. And this is what I want to do with this issue, because the First Minister is right. I have been supporting WASPI campaigners in Murray, in the House of Commons, and with their campaign. They deserve justice, and part of the road towards justice is taking the recommendations from this report and delivering on those. But timing is crucial as well. And in my letter to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, I was urging him and the UK Government to respond to this report as quickly as possible. In response, Mel Stride has said they are looking at this and they are looking at all of the recommendations, including the recommendation to pay compensation. But the First Minister has also been correct to say this is an issue that is not and should not be political. There are members of every political party who have individually at a local level or nationally in Parliament raised this issue time and time again. I want to pay tribute to Carolyn Harris from the Labour Party, who in the UK Parliament certainly did, I think still does, co-chair the WASPI APPG with my Conservative colleague Tim Lawton. The Conservative MP Peter Aldous repeatedly raises this issue time and time again. Patricia Gibson, most recently on behalf of the SNP, was challenging the UK Government to respond to this report and the recommendations contained within the report as a matter of urgency. The WASPI women have got people from across the political spectrum to listen to their issues, to listen to their concerns, but crucially, on a non-partisan basis, the PHSO has listened to them, has accepted there was maladministration. And I think it's also very important to remember that the report could only look at not whether it was right or not to change the age of the state pension for women. And I again agree with the First Minister. No WASPI women I have ever met was against the equality of that issue. It was how it was communicated. So from the very first moment I have spoken on this subject, I have raised concerns about how that was communicated. And there is no doubt from the summary of the complaint and the findings of this report that there was maladministration. It states clear that was maladministration. That was also maladministration. The maladministration has been rightly brought to the fore with this report, this comprehensive report which does require thorough discussion, debate and also a response from the UK Government. That's why the amendment I brought forward today, I think, echoes much of what the First Minister himself was putting forward, but in a way that I think we can all support. And I would hope, as I said at the very beginning, in his reflections, he may consider today of all days and the work and the words he and the Deputy First Minister used today about this Parliament working together. Maybe he and the Scottish Government can accept our amendment today, so this Parliament sends a united voice that we support the efforts of the WASPI women and we want to see the recommendations of this report promptly responded to by the UK Government. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I now call Paul O'Kane to speak to move Amendment 13041.1. Up to 6 minutes. Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. And I welcome the debate today and this opportunity to join with colleagues in saying to the First Minister that I wish him well after the past week. And indeed, it is nice to debate him again. I think we last possibly did this when he was the Health Secretary and I was a Shadow Health Minister, and perhaps we will have more time in the future to debate issues across this chamber. And I note what he said in his speech about this being a gendered issue, and I also note what Douglas Ross said about the timetabling of this debate being quite rushed. And I do hope that we will have time to debate the toxic masculinity debate that was intended to be in this slot soon as well, because I think those issues are really important to women and girls and to men reflecting on their responsibilities across the country as well. And I wish to begin, Deputy Presiding Officer, as I often do in debates, by pointing to the consensus that I think is in the chamber. And I think we've already heard this around the experiences of our constituents who are WASPI women. Scottish Labour welcome the publication of the Public Health Service Ombudsman's report. I think it has produced an incredibly detailed and serious piece of work, and it fully merits and must be given thoughtful and purposeful consideration and action. Because the report lays out clearly that there were failings in communications to changes to the state pension age. Labour opposed those changes at the time when George Osborne took the decision to accelerate increases in the state pension age without sufficient notice to women affected, an action which has rightly angered them. And I want to say to WASPI women on behalf of my party today, and to all those WASPI women who are in the gallery and who we represent, we want to thank them for their efforts and congratulate them, as the Government's motion does, on the work that they have done to bring this report to this point. And indeed, I have had the opportunity to talk to many impacted constituents and WASPI campaigners, including recently at that drop-in the First Minister referred to, which I do thank Claire Hockey for arranging as well. So the PHSO has been clear that it is now for Government to respond, and they must do so at pace. WASPI women have been waiting long enough, and so this current Government in the UK must set out how it will take forward the recommendations and next steps. Because I have to say that this current Government have been slow to act on a range of injustices we have seen, whether that be the Post Office scandal or the infected blood scandal, which members will know are serious concerns of injustice at this time. And whilst we would appreciate that process has to be gone through and that there is detailed work to be done, it is clear that there must be speed in terms of the response of the Work and Pension Secretary and the Government, because people have waited too long. And very often on other issues, as I have mentioned, they can cross the line into what feels like apathy and a lack of feeling towards those who are victims of those injustices. And I think what is crucial in all of this is that we listen to the women who have the experience of having fought and campaigned over many years and have been seriously impacted by these issues. And the Government needs to take the responsibility to engage with them and other stakeholders on how it's going to address these findings. So let me be absolutely clear. Let me be absolutely clear. Labour does support the delivery of justice for WASPy women, but we've also been clear. We have been absolutely clear that we support justice for WASPy women. I assume that the First Minister wishes to intervene. I'm not sure when that photo was taken, but it certainly doesn't look like that at the end of this week. But maybe in the future, I'll give it.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, that is an awfully cruel thing to add insult to injury, I have to say, to put up a photo where it was only yesterday, actually, that photo. In all seriousness, the point of consensus between Paul O'Kane and I is that nobody is arguing about the maladministration and the bad communication from the UK Government. There's also no disagreement between Paul O'Kane and I about the fact that Conservatives are unlikely to act. So the WASPy women I met this afternoon had a very clear question. It is no different to the question I asked Douglas Ross. If there is a future UK Labour government, can Paul O'Kane commit that they will pay compensation? Let's not argue about the level of compensation, but will they pay compensation to the WASPy women affected if the Conservatives don't act? Yes or no?
Paul O'Kane.
I thank the First Minister for that intervention. And I had this conversation with WASPy women in this very Parliament at that event that I spoke about as well, and we were very clear that we support the principles contained within the PSHO report, which is a principle to compensate those women. He says that let's not talk about the level, but of course his motion does speak in quite specifics about the level. So I do think we have to reflect on that as well. I think I'm clear, Deputy Presiding Officer, that we are in support of the principle of compensation. So I'm not quite. No, excuse me. Yes.
Mr. O'Kane.
Excuse me. I'm going.
Resume your seat a second. We've listened to all of the speakers so far with courtesy and respect. Can we continue in a similar vein? Paul O'Kane.
Thank you. And I think what's important to the WASPy women who are listening in the gallery is that they heard what I've just said, instead of the barracking that we had from the backbenchers who clearly want to make this a political issue about the Labour Party. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, as I have said already, Labour supports the delivery of that justice for WASPy women. But we are very, very clear that we need to ensure that WASPy women are part of that process, that we ensure that any system of compensation has to be designed with those women in mind and round the table in making those decisions, because the Ombudsman has made a number of recommendations about how any such system might move forward. Of course, that could be, blanket compensation, or it could be looking at individual cases, and I know there is a variance of views from many women on what should be done there. I am very conscious that the Deputy Presiding Officer is looking at me to wrap up, and we have had a number of exchanges within that. But I am very clear, as I have said at the outset, that Labour will support the WASPy women, that we will support the outcomes of this recommendation within the report, and indeed that we will support pensioners more widely through the triple lock and other measures that we will seek to take. So I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr. O'Kane. I now call Maggie Chapman up to 4 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Apologies. Every 13 minutes, a WASPy woman dies. Every 13 minutes, a woman who might have lost several years' worth of her pension, maybe as much as £42,000, dies without justice. Because of changes made in the 1995 State Pension Act, designed to equalise pensions, women born in the 1950s have lost out, with as many as 3.6 million women affected. And this number includes at least 23,000 women in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. None of these women disagrees with the pension equalisation. They do, however, disagree with the unfair way in which the changes were introduced. Significant changes to their pension age were imposed without widespread consultation, with little or no notice, and much faster than they were promised. And some women have been hit by more than one increase, with subsequent pension changes in 2011. In March this year, as we've heard, the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman ruled that the UK Government had mishandled changes to the pension age, leaving many of those women facing hardship. Until the 1990s, many women were not allowed to join company pension schemes, and because they didn't have time to plan for the pension changes, they are now struggling to make ends meet. Many of the women affected started working before equalities legislation came into place in the 1970s. Many were forced to leave work if they got married, and many didn't get maternity pay if they had children. Older women now are often not able to find appropriate jobs, and many cannot work as they are carers for other family members or are themselves not able to work because of their own health conditions. The WASPI women have been subjected to systematic discrimination, and the pension fiasco is just the latest example. It should also be noted that many older women, when in receipt of either a salary or a pension, tend to spend that money in their local economies. So it is not just the women and their immediate families who have lost out and suffered, but their wider communities, our communities too. In the recent report, the PHSO also said that the affected women should be paid up to £2,950 each by way of compensation for hardship faced, because the UK government had mishandled changes to the pension age. And this mishandling, this maladministration, had left many of them facing hardship. WASPI women, and probably many of us in this chamber, think that this level of compensation suggested is, and I quote a WASPI woman, a slap in the face. It is appalling that the DWP responsible for this maladministration has said it will not pay even this measly amount. As Linda Carmichael, co-chair of WASPI Scotland, says, an apology doesn't pay the bills. After the publication of the PHSO report, another WASPI campaigner, Lorraine Ray, has said, and I quote, "We are pleased that, after a long wait, we have been vindicated and have achieved a moral victory. But we must now also be compensated financially for the losses we suffered. We now require compensation without a protracted period of debate and stalling, during which many more WASPI women will die before receiving what they are due." I want to pay special tribute to Linda and Lorraine for their tireless work in Aberdeen, and indeed all the phenomenal WASPI women campaigners across Scotland. I know they will not let up in their fight for fair and fast compensation. We should all be able to stand in solidarity with WASPI women, our mothers, sisters, carers, neighbours and friends, in their fight for justice. In closing, Presiding Officer, I am pleased to reaffirm my and the Scottish Greens' unwavering support for the WASPI campaign. We believe the WASPI women should have fair and fast compensation, and we urge the UK Government to act, and act quickly, to prevent any more damage to WASPI women. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a reminder, we have no time in hand, and therefore you will need to stick to your speaking limits from now on. Beatrice Wishart, up to 4 minutes, please. Ms Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to debate the Ombudsman's recommendations this afternoon, and as Deputy Convener of the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group for WASPI, I recognise the hard work of all those involved in the campaign. And just in case it wasn't obvious, Presiding Officer, I should confess that I am a 1950s woman as well. I have friends and family, as I'm sure colleagues do across the chamber, affected by the decision to increase the state pension age. And as the First Minister said, it was never about the equalisation, but how it was done. There's a distinct feeling of a lack of fairness involved, with a sense that the goalposts were moved without being informed. We can debate whether this would ever have happened if we were talking about another group in society. But a combination of misogyny and ageism resulted in older women being overlooked by grey suits in Whitehall. Little wonder older women feel invisible in our society. The word WASPI quickly became a catch-all for all the various groups who've campaigned about the lack of notice for increasing the state pension. The WASPI campaigners have only ever asked for fairness and to rectify injustices. Sadly, some of those campaigners have passed away and will not see the justice they sought. The irony is not lost that WASPI women are from the generation who campaigned for women's rights. We shouldn't forget that the rights that women have today are in no small way due to the women who were born in the 1950s. Maternity pay and maternity leave were not available to women who had their children in the 60s and early 70s. And when they came to retirement, some women made decisions about their future, such as offering childcare for grandchildren, only to cruelly find that financially they wouldn't be able to do so. They've had to continue to work or take additional part-time, often low-paid jobs just to survive the years when they thought they would have their state pension. Close the Gaps briefing reminds us that there's a gendered element to pension inequality. Women are likely to take on more caring responsibilities with interruptions in their careers, reducing opportunities to contribute to pension savings. Women are living longer and more likely to live in poverty after retirement, with fewer savings than men.
and Close the Gap highlight that 2/3 of pensioners in poverty are women and half of pensioners in poverty are single women, and I'm quite sure WASPI women know the reality of that. The Ombudsman report's been a long time coming. The process needs to be moved along to ensure those affected finally get compensation. I urge the UK Government to act on the Ombudsman's report and encourage whichever party forms the next government after the general election to make this a priority. It should be remembered that this will not be simply an outgoing from Treasury. There will be returns to local economies and national taxes from compensation payments. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, the 1950s women we've been talking about were among the first to vote at 18, saw several waves of feminism and new protections under legislation, yet as working citizens they were let down by the state. It's past time to rectify this injustice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Wishart. We move to the open debate. I call first Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Ros McCall. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I pay tribute to all women against state pension inequality campaigners. In particular, Ayrshire WASPI, who many MSPs met when they visited Parliament 2 weeks ago. Their dedication, courage and tireless advocacy has shone the brightest light possible on the injustice facing women born in the 1950s. This is, of course, a problem created by successive Labour, Coalition and Tory Westminster governments which raised the state pension age for women without giving them due notice. As a result, 3.7 million women across the UK born between the 6th of April 1950 and 5th of April 1960 were thrown into an impossible situation, including more than 336,000 in Scotland and 6,940 in North Ayrshire and Nairn constituency alone. Department of Work and Pensions figures make plain the scale of the hardship. In North Ayrshire and Nairn, between 2013 and February 2021, the number of women aged 60 and above claiming incapacity benefits rose 315%, while working age out of work benefit claims increased 472%. This is a generation of women that had already been victims of pay discrimination. Without enough notice to financially plan, WASPI women found themselves having to work years longer than anticipated. Many who could not or retired from work anticipating the state pension have endured financial hardship because they were then unable to access the pension they deserve and were promised. I know from speaking to women affected by this scandal how much it has devastated lives. Pushed into poverty as what savings they had dwindled away, women have had to abandon plans to care for elderly or infirm relatives or take low-paid, insecure or manual work. The scale of this injustice is matched only by the dignity of the WASPI campaign itself. After 5 long years, the UK Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman published its final report on women's state pension age. The report vindicated campaigners, finding thousands of women impacted by the DWP's maladministration and failure to properly notify them about changes to their state pension age, stating, "Women lost opportunities to make informed decisions about their finances. It diminished their sense of personal autonomy and financial control." Despite this vindication, the Ombudsman cannot force the UK Government to pay compensation. Shockingly, the DWP indicated its refusal to comply, leading the Ombudsman to take the rare but necessary step of asking Parliament to intervene. However, following the statement on women's state pension age at Westminster on 25th of March, neither the Tories nor Labour is committed to delivering any compensation. Despite at least 12 shadow cabinet members and Keir Starmer previously supporting calls for restitution, not a single one repeated that backing following the Ombudsman's report. Meanwhile, Presiding Officer, more than 277,000 WASPI women have already passed away without receiving any recompense. More WASPI women die each new day of dither, delay and deferment from the UK Government and His Majesty's loyal opposition. The SNP, in contrast, demands that after years of UK Government inaction, WASPI women must now receive the justice, apology and compensation they deserve without further delay. My wife, MP for North Ayrshire and Nairn, Patricia Gibson, has vigorously championed the cause of WASPI women, as Douglas Ross pointed out, and is the only MP to have spoken in every Westminster debate on this subject since her election in 2015. She will lead a backbench business debate in the House on the 16th of May, after which MPs will vote on whether or not they support justice, delivering prompt compensation for WASPI women. For it's not the warm words offered by the Tories and Labour today they seek, but recompense. We will see then where each party truly stands on this important issue.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. I now call Ros McCall to be followed by Marie McNair. Up to 4 minutes. Ms McCall.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It wouldn't be a contribution from me unless I started with the personal anecdote. As a child that grew up in the 1970s in Glasgow and hit the job market in the late 1980s, the position of female equality was still moving on from legislation such as the Sex Discrimination Act. I think it's hard for women now to even imagine a Scotland where they were not allowed to have a bank account or a bank loan without the additional signatory on the account of a father or a husband, but that's how it was. The idea of feminism and pure, undiluted equality was an absolute driving force for me. It was well discussed that there would have to be some radical changes to allow women and men to be treated equally within the law. Some of them would be good, some of them would be bad, but it was universally accepted that radical change was needed nonetheless. And in 1995, when the State Pension Act included plans to increase women's state pension age from 60 to 65, with the gradual increase that was to take place over a decade, it was pretty much accepted, and I certainly don't have any recollection of myself or my friends or anyone really disagreeing with the need for a more equal state pension process encompassing men and women. So I think it's important to mention this because we should actually be mindful that the report from the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman isn't actually looking at that decision, and that's been mentioned already, but rather that the report was to investigate how the decisions that were being made were communicated and explained, and their failings. Firstly, I want to mention the fact that the Ombudsman has taken over 5 years to produce this final report. I think that reflects the complexities surrounding this matter, and I understand the strong feelings on the issue. So it's right that due care and attention was given when producing the report. It's right that the investigation considers approximately 30 years. It's right it goes all the way back to 1995. And it's right that all changes made throughout successive governments were thoroughly investigated. But as I said, the debate before us isn't questioning the decisions themselves, but the communication of them. And I quote the opening sentence from the motion: "The Parliament welcomes the report from the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman." So it's in that context that we're discussing, and I do welcome the report. It's a serious report which requires serious consideration, and I want to place on record my view that we must continue to have dialogue with all those who have been impacted. And as our amendment states, the UK Government must respond in full to the substantial report and the recommendations contained within it as quickly as possible. I also agree with the recommendation to pay compensation to those affected, and I add my congratulations to the WASPI women and campaigners for their hard work and diligence in getting to this point. Now the Ombudsman has provided the information, the UK Government has agreed to consider the report's findings and will bring back an update to Parliament. I think that's absolutely right, but they must do it at pace. Of course, there were numerous findings within the report, and some of its conclusions around access to information, complaint handling and the introduction of transitional arrangements are also very important to consider and should certainly form part of a broader reflection by the UK Government. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I applaud the UK Government's commitment to the full and proper consideration of the Ombudsman's report and to do its continued full and constructive engagement. I wait to hear their findings with interest, and I state we need to do it at pace. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McCall. I now call Marie McNair to be followed by Katy Clark. Up to 4 minutes, Ms McNair.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate, and I thank the First Minister for bringing this to the Chamber. WASPI women work tirelessly throughout their lives only to find themselves facing a 6-year delay to receiving their pension. And this left many struggling to make ends meet and facing financial uncertainty at a time when they should have been able to relax and put their feet up. It's estimated that in my constituency, more than 4,700 women in Eastern Bartonshire and over 6,000 in Western Bartonshire have been affected by the changes to the state pension age. I welcome the report from the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman into the pensions injustices on women born in the 50s. It is clear on the damning failures of the UK Government and their need to act now. They need to deliver on the recommendations to pay compensation in full to these women without any further delay. The Ombudsman report is clear. Some women born in the 1950s were not adequately informed of the impact of the changes. Accurate and timely information had not been given to millions of women in the UK, including 356,000 in Scotland. These women were unfairly penalised for circumstances out with their control, facing the consequences of a policy that was not properly communicated to them. And this gave most of them no time to prepare. And as noted by my colleague Alan Brown MP, who I commend for his unwavering commitment on this issue, these are the very same women who were paid less than men, who didn't have maternity rights, and those private pensions were smaller than men's pensions if they had them at all. So by raising the pension age without due notice, these women were further penalised. I met with WASPI women, including some of my own constituents, at the parliamentary demonstration a couple of weeks ago. And I was proud to stand with them in their fight, and I was glad to get the chance to speak more with them. The recommended payouts are paltry sums, and I echo the WASPI women's calls for compensation that reflect decades of mistreatment. These women are here to stay, and we will keep fighting for them. And in the face of injustice, the WASPI women have shown determination and courage. They have spent considerable time advocating for change and raising awareness of their plight. There are so many WASPI women groups who have done so much amazing work, and in my constituency, I am proud to support the Western Bartonshire Women Against State Pension Injustice Group. Their coordinator, Liz Daly, whom I have met with several times now, has committed so much time to the cause, and for that I am so grateful. This group and all WASPI women will be remembered for their resilience, determination and unwavering commitment to justice. And I will always be a supporter of the WASPI women alongside my SNP colleagues here today. But of course, the fight is not over. The Westminster Government made a real mess of this, and it's time for the women to receive their rightful compensation. The Tory Government must act and right this wrong. If not them, then Labour must commit to compensate WASPI women. So I genuinely ask again, Labour MSPs here, for their commitment. I don't want a faked manufacturer position to be used in Scotland in this debate, as so far their leader has refused to commit to compensating these women, which is shameful, and that's a betrayal of every single WASPI woman. We need cross-party commitments to ensure justice is delivered for these women. They've waited too long. The time is now to provide fast and fair compensation. Time will tell, and unfortunately, what WASPI women don't have is time. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Katy Clark to be followed by Kevin Stewart. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Clark.
It is a pleasure to get the opportunity to contribute to this important debate and to call on the UK Government to take action now to deliver justice and compensation for WASPI women. WASPI women are calling for the UK Government, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Mel Stride, to come to the chamber of the House of Commons to outline his response to the recent report from the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, and to come forward with his government's proposal to address this injustice. This Parliament should also be calling for that. And frankly, it is astonishing that there hasn't even been a statement in the House of Commons up till now. As convener of the cross-party group on WASPI since 2021, it has been a pleasure to work with WASPI campaigners in Scotland, some of whom are in the gallery today, some of whom have had 3 visits to this Parliament in the last fortnight to lobby politicians, and who have consistently campaigned for justice for women who were born in the 1950s and indeed for compensation. And we know that many of the women affected are in financial difficulties. MSPs and indeed MPs from all political parties represented in this chamber have been involved in the cross-party group, and it would have been helpful to have an agreed motion to come out of this Parliament today. A great deal of work was undertaken by Labour prior to the 2021 general election, which included a manifesto commitment with a detailed package of compensation. Labour, of course, were not elected, and it is for the Conservatives to deliver justice now. Last month, the Parliamentary Health and Service Ombudsman published his long-awaited Stage 2 and Stage 3 reports on the Department of Work and Pensions maladministration, and it's maladministration only that report deals with. The WASPI campaign was launched in 2021. We know that since then it is estimated that 377,400 WASPI women have died. And it is estimated that one 1950s woman born in that time dies every 13 minutes. 1/3 of WASPI women are in debt and 1 in 4 are living under the poverty line. In Ayrshire, it is estimated that 26,590 women have been affected, and WASPI campaigners in Ayrshire have done considerable work to quantify the loss to those women, the loss to the communities in which they live, and indeed to make the case that compensation paid to these women would mainly be spent in local communities and indeed would be a benefit to the whole of the local community. I think it's fair to say that many WASPI women are very disappointed that after a 67-month-long investigation, the levels of compensation proposed are relatively low. The Ombudsman's report, of course, related to maladministration only. The UK Government must come forward quickly with its response to this report and indeed to proposals. And if they don't deal with it, the next UK Government must. We must deliver justice and compensation to these women.
Thank you. I now call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Jeremy Balfour, up to 4 minutes. Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the First Minister for bringing this debate today. I know that many folk heard the First Minister speak at Claire Hawkey's event with WASPI women the other week, and it is very clear the First Minister's passion for this issue. I had the pleasure of meeting some Aberdeen WASPI campaigners at Claire Hawkey's event, Linda and Helen. People who have campaigned very hard for justice. And I always enjoy meeting Linda and Helen, but I would like to meet with them under different circumstances, after they have been paid the compensation that they rightly deserve. And I think we have to look at these scenarios very closely. These women, many of whom had built their lives around a specific retirement plan, were forced to keep working years longer than anticipated in many cases. And this was not just an economic hardship, it was a betrayal of trust. And it is estimated that almost 356,000 women in Scotland were impacted by the WASPI pension scandal. Many were already in ill health, and others had taken early retirement and were planning to get by until age 60, when they thought they would receive their state pension. Now, the UK Government continues to argue that communication happened, but let's be clear, the rug was pulled out from underneath these women. The Parliamentary Health and Health Service Ombudsman has judged that the UK Government failed to adequately inform thousands of women that the state pension age had changed. WASPI women are not asking for handouts. They are asking for recognition of the burden placed upon them and compensation for the additional years worked. And the strength and perseverance of the WASPI women are an inspiration. They have raised their voices, and it's time for the UK Government to listen and, more importantly, act. Now, we've heard from some speakers today around about more dialogue. Now is not the time for more dialogue. There's been too much dialogue. It is time to compensate these women. But in all of this, this is not just about the past. It's about the future. We cannot allow similar situations to happen again. Transparency and clear communication about pension changes are absolutely essential. Supporting the WASPI woman is also about ensuring that today's working age adults don't have their pensions whisked away by the swish of a Westminster ministerial pen. And let's be crystal clear, if the Tory government and maybe a Labour government to follow get away with this outrage against the WASPy women, they'll be coming for the pensions of the rest of us next. And just today, the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak refused to rule out raising the state pension to age 75. What happened to the WASPy woman sets the stage for what Westminster may well do next. And if they get away with their outrageous treatment of WASPy women, they will try it on with everyone else. Let's make sure that the WASPy women get justice. Let's compensate these women now.
Thank you. I now call Jeremy Balfour to be followed by Christine Graham. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's always good when we get to discuss social security in the Scottish Parliament. I have to say that I think this is possibly the most stacked the front benches have been on social security debate in a long time. However, I suspect that it's not just the topic, but the person moving the motion that has drawn people here this afternoon. And, Presiding Officer, I hope that the First Minister has chosen this topic as a swan song in order not just to take one last shot at the UK Government, but actually to bring together this chamber so that we can unite. And I hope he has taken seriously the offer in the amendment by those on this benches, and that the Government will accept it so that we can have a voice going back to London which represents the whole of this Parliament. Because the picture we see before us is that the UK Government is taking time to consider carefully the findings of the report to find the best and most substantial way forward. That has to be correct. We must get this right because people have waited too long. No one in this chamber, no one in this debate is denying that the situation that we have reached is regrettable. Women planned their lives around the information they had at the time, and there can be no doubt that this situation has left them worse off. That does not negate the fact that the governments have responsibility to ensure that any and all unintended consequences are taken into account before any decision is made. We cannot rush in to making decisions. We have seen in this Parliament, when rush decisions are made, when bad legislation is brought forward, it then doesn't survive the time going forward. Presiding Officer, of course we want the WASPy women to be given a fair deal. Apart from the fact that it is the right thing to do, they have fought hard and run a successful campaign over the last number of years that deserves a just solution. But we must ensure that the compensation is affordable and allows our social security system across the whole of the United Kingdom to remain sustainable. That, after all, has to be our consideration when taking any form of social security decision. There has to be an acknowledgement that decisions that are made today will have consequences that reach far into our future. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time on this occasion. It is a consideration that has been unfortunately lacking sometimes here in Scotland since the partial devolution of benefit. We here in Scotland are fast racking up a bill that will become unsustainable even by 2026. On the topic of pension compensation, as with social security more broadly, we have to balance our generosity with our responsibility. To close, Presiding Officer, I welcome the report and look forward to the full response of the UK Government when we have fully considered how to move forward in a fair and affordable way. All those involved deserve nothing less, and I hope that the UK Government will respond in a speedy and appropriate manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Balfour. I now call Christine Graham to be followed by Claire Baker. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Graham.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. First of all, I commend the WASPI women in Midlothian, South Tweedale and Lauderdale and across Scotland for their resilience and determination to see justice for all women affected by the unilateral changes to the state pension. Indeed, I myself tabled a motion in March this year as follows, and I'll truncate it, that the Parliament recognises the report's findings, which reflect on failings by the DWP to provide accurate, adequate and timely information about changes to the state pension age for women, and acknowledges what it sees as the significant detrimental impact that the DWP's failure to communicate effectively has had on the affected women's ability to plan for their retirement and the financial implications this has created. Deprived of the pension that they rightly deserve, and further believes that their fight for justice is taking far too long to be adequately addressed, and urges the UK Government to acknowledge the DWP's failings as highlighted in the report, issue an immediate apology and deliver fair compensation, and so on, close quotes. Now, I do want to be consensual, but I know nobody from Labour, nobody from the Tories, nobody from Liberal Democrats signed that motion, which I don't think is a hostile motion. But I consider as a fact that the provision of the state pension is a contract between the government, so the unilateral variation of the terms of that quotes, contract quotes, should not have been implemented. I think we all agree that as times have moved on, the equalisation of men and women's eligibility for the state pension, but the manner in which eligibility for the state pension was increased was at best clumsy and at worst brutally unjust. The latter is supported by that parliamentary report by the Parliament and Health Services Ombudsman. Which brings me to the yawning gap between the compensation level recommended in that report, which is between £1,000 and £2,950, and the claim of the WASPI women, which I don't think is over the top, for £10,000. Maggie Chapman quite rightly drew attention to the fact that a woman who has been lost 7 years of it might have lost £40,000 in value. Now, even the 2950 is derisory, as the moving finishing line for retirement age has left and will leave many in financial difficulties. Indeed, the recent announcement that a failed asylum seeker who volunteered to be transported to Rwanda was given £3,000 cash and other expenses paid. So that puts it in even more context of what a slap in the face this is to the WASPI women. A survey of 8,000 WASPI women carried out in autumn 2023, and I'll be brief, found that 25%, a quarter, had struggled to buy food in the past 6 months. What a condemnation. I know when I myself became eligible for the state pension, and I say to Beatrice Wishart, unfortunately I was born in the 40s, I had planned my finances on that basis that I would retire at 60. I didn't know I was coming here. Especially to time the paying off of my mortgage, having divorced in my late 50s. And divorce is not uncommon these days in older people. This adds to the financial pressures on women who may have been relying on a partner to support them and for them mutually to finance each other. So UK ministers must set up a compensation scheme that provides full and genuine compensation for the women concerned. Look at the figures I've quoted. So far, the Conservative government and Labour opposition have not come forward with such a scheme, and I think it's time to walk the walk. No more talking about it. We know the position. It has fallen to the SNP people like Patricia Gibson to push for justice. But I have to say, and perhaps not the kindest of note, perhaps that's why no Labour or Tory MSPs signed my motion in the first place.
Thank you. I now call the final speaker in the open debate, Claire Baker, up to 4 minutes. Ms Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin by recognising the significance of this debate from the WASPI women and their ongoing work in the pursuit of justice. They have been tenacious in fighting their cause. It is important that the UK Government makes no further delay in responding to the findings of the Ombudsman's report. The current Government must respond, and it cannot leave it to the next Government to clear up this mess. The Chancellor's comment that there is no secret vault of money is a far from helpful response. We are well aware of the sorry state of the UK Government's finances as a result of mismanagement and unfunded spending commitments at the hands of the Conservatives. Regrettably, there are other examples of the UK Government trying to delay resolution when it comes to being at fault. The Post Office Horizon cases, the contaminated blood scandal and the Windrush compensation scheme all have parallels. While the UK Government argues that the information on the changes was provided through some routes, The Ombudsman report is clear in its conclusions that it failed in communication, and this is maladministration. Decision-making by the DWP did not give proper weight to targeted information. That research, the need to appropriately target information, was ignored, and as a result the public wasn't provided with as full information as possible. It failed to promptly write to affected women, taking years longer than it should have, and further restricting the ability of many women to adjust their retirement plans. The WASPI campaign argues that many affected women in fact did not find out about the change until as late as 2012. Some had only 1 year's notice of a 6-year delay to their retirement, and many had already left work. Across the Chamber, it is true that some of us are closer to retirement than others, but most of us will have thought about our retirement or are actively planning for it. For many people approaching the end of their working life, to find out that rather than being able to retire in a year's time, they have another 6 years before that can happen, this would have a huge impact, not just financially, but also mentally. Women who have planned for retirement at 60 may have been expected to take on caregiver roles, which they were then not able to do if they had to continue working. And those who were unable to stay in employment had to rely on savings to get by. There was no secret vault of money for them either, but they had to somehow make it work. Today, if you want to check when you will reach state pension age, you can do it almost immediately on the government's website. That currently comes with a caveat. It may increase by up to a year for those born between April 1970 and 1978, as well as a general note on the potential for change. But we know that misleading information on the pension age for women was still on the government website until as late as 2016. And Labour has called for an improved notification system that will ensure future generations are able to properly plan for retirement with timely and targeted information. We must take lessons from this process. It has highlighted the importance of properly considering correspondence and complaints, and particularly looking at patterns and potential consequences, and there are similarities here with the Horizon scandal. We also need to be aware that, as the DWP's own research showed, making policy announcements is not enough. As members of Parliament or government, we need to be realistic and recognise that at times we operate in a bubble and that most people do not keep on top of policy announcements. The personalisation of news consumption, the fog of disinterest, the sheer breadth of information available, the budding of bad news, this can all add up to a lack of awareness that we need to work to address. We need to ask ourselves whether the duty of government to communicate is always sufficient or whether more needs to be done to engage. And on the issue of WASPI women, we need to see an immediate response from the UK Government and a resolution to the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Baker. We now move to closing speeches, and I call first Maggie Chapman, up to 4 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Apologies. Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister is absolutely right. If such an injustice had been experienced by men, the way that the WASPI women have been treated, something would have been done, and done years ago, to remedy the injustices they faced. These injustices are typical of the structural and systemic inequalities that women face in many, some would say all, aspects of life. Despite equalities legislation being in place for decades, we still see gender pay gaps, unequal access to services, the labour market, benefits and so much more. And we know that inequalities and discrimination don't stop there. So it is right that perhaps in stark contrast to the last couple of weeks in Scottish politics, there has been a fair degree of consensus across the Chamber today. I wish we could get such agreement on all equalities issues. I want to thank those who have contributed to the debate today. I think it is important that so many different WASPI groups and women have been recognised and celebrated in this Chamber. I hope we see the political action at Westminster to match the words we've heard here this afternoon. Turning briefly to the two amendments we have in front of us, I've listened carefully to the contributions from both Douglas Ross, Paul O'Kane and their colleagues. Despite the agreement we have, I'm afraid I cannot support the Conservative amendment because it removes the clause that talks specifically about the need for a higher level of compensation for WASPI women to properly reflect the financial harm they have faced. Yes.
Douglas Ross.
Maggie Chapman for giving way. As I was trying to explain in my speech, I think we can come back to the wider issue of the full compensation in a separate debate, but there would be an opportunity today to focus on the PHSO report, which was the bulk of the government motion, and that would send a very strong message if we could unite around that and then come back to the other issues at another time.
Maggie Chapman.
For that intervention, and I think we do have agreement around the PHSO's report. However, I consider the element that you have removed, that fuller compensation, fairer compensation, to be a vital and intrinsic aspect of the WASPI campaign, one that Scottish Greens support. So I believe we should retain it today. As far as the Labour amendment goes, I agree with the principle and sentiment of it and the detail of most of it. Greens have long supported and called for a clear system of notifications about future pension changes. We have always supported the pension triple lock, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to put that on the record again today. But we cannot endorse what is clearly part of the Labour general election campaign machine, so we will abstain on this amendment this afternoon at decision time. But in closing, Presiding Officer, I thank the Scottish Government for bringing this debate today and colleagues across the Chamber for their contributions. But most of all, I thank the WASPI women for their tireless fight for fair and fast compensation, for justice. While we have been here this afternoon, 7 WASPI women might have died without that justice. We should act together for them, and the UK Government definitely must. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call Michael Mara up to 6 minutes. Mr Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by joining all colleagues in paying tribute to the WASPI women and their campaigning. Scottish Labour are supportive of them in their campaign for justice. And the report from the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman is a major and vital step forward in that campaign, that search for justice. And it's one which the Labour Party welcomes. It does demand full consideration and robust action from the UK Government. It's clear these women have been dreadfully let down by the changes made by the UK Government to their pension provision. Lives were altered forever by the Government's failure to communicate the impact of changes to the state pension age. Beatrice Wisher, I thought, very eloquently set out the impact on so many women across Scotland, their plans for retirement, the life they hoped for, caring for grandchildren snatched from them, the hopes that they held for their later years cruelly dashed. And as highlighted by many colleagues, there have been parliamentarians from across all parties that have stood alongside those WASPI women, sometimes when they were less listened to than they are now, and less vindicated than they are now by this report. They have listened, they have demanded action, and those parliamentarians changed the debate in their own parties. I met Patricia Gibson MP for the first time on a Finance Committee visit to Westminster just a few weeks ago, and she had come directly from the Chamber where she had been raising this exact issue, which I know she has done time and again alongside colleagues from many parties. But I pay tribute to her for that work as raised by Kenneth Gibson earlier on. But far too often in our society, it is women who bear the brunt of injustice, women who are forgotten and left behind. And I hope more broadly that the WASPI Women's campaign has changed how some of these issues are discussed and dealt with. I pay tribute to that tireless campaigner who knew that what had happened was not right and called for justice. And this Public Health Service Ombudsman report, it only exists because of that campaign. So on these benches, we know just how much this campaign means to them, and we're pleased to see them finally receiving that recognition. But recognition clearly is not enough. And the UK Government must urgently respond to the PHSO report, and we in the Labour Party urge them to get on with that important task as quickly as possible. Labour, of course, is not in power, and so it is for this Government to act now on the recommendations in the PHSO report. WASPI women have been let down for too long, and they deserve better than government intransigence, dither and delay. They must be engaged with, and the UK Government must work with them to develop that scheme. And I do reject, I have to say, Kevin Stewart MSP's view that the time for dialogue is at an end. This is the scheme that must be developed with the WASPI women, must be done with them rather than to them. And our Westminster Labour colleagues are also engaging with the report fully and developing our own response. On these benches, we are desperate for a UK Labour government, and we believe that it can make changes, significant changes in these areas. But as part of our considerations, any party with a realistic chance of forming a government owes it to the public to be as honest as we possibly can about the economic and fiscal realities bequeathed to them, in this case by the economic carnage of the Conservatives with 14 years of austerity and a trust-induced economic meltdown. And Labour will not make uncosted spending commitments or promise unfunded tax cuts like the Tories. We must be honest with the public about the challenges in our public finances and the difficult decisions that would be required if we were to have the privilege of serving as forming a next UK government, in order to fix that mess that the Tories have left behind. For that reason, I cannot make uncosted commitments with specific compensation numbers. But Paul O'Kane, MSP, in opening this debate for Labour, set out very clearly our agreement with the principle of the recommendations in the PHSO report, and we want to see that acted upon. We are also determined that a Labour government will look after our pensioners. And I reject wholesale some of that rhetoric from SNP benches regarding future pension provision. That's why we are committed to the triple lock and why we put it in our amendment today. And I hope that the SNP government is able to back that. When we were last in government, we lifted 1 million pensioners out of poverty and introduced pension credit. When the Tories broke the triple lock, we campaigned against it and have pledged to retain it should we have the chance to serve in government. If the public gives us that chance to serve in government again, we will grow the economy, get our public services, our NHS, crucially back on their feet, and restore the public finances to a sustainable footing. No, I'm just closing, I'm afraid. This is the kind of sensible country, including pensioners, are crying out for. So I close by paying tribute again to the Waspie women, and I look forward to justice being delivered.
Thank you. I now call Megan Gallagher. Up to 7 minutes. Ms Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Parliament was not scheduled to hold a debate on Waspie women today. The original debate, of course, this afternoon was on positive masculinity, and I was looking forward to talking about men's sheds and how they're helping men to open up about their mental health, but also creating generations of role models that will help and support younger men so they too can become role models in their family and amongst their friends, especially when it comes to relationships with women. Considering the Equalities Committee is looking at suicide prevention and suicide is the biggest killer in men under the age of 35, I do hope that this debate can be rescheduled, and I am pleased that Paul O'Kane has also called on this debate to take place at another point. Turning to the crux of the debate today, my party leader Douglas Ross has set out the Scottish Conservative position on the Waspie campaign, and I want to echo his remarks and others when congratulating the women who have been relentless in their efforts to obtain compensation for the changes to their state pension. This view, of course, has been echoed by many members during their contributions today. Presiding Officer, I've often stood up in this chamber and fought for women's issues since being elected in 2021. I recognise how painful this campaign has been, and I don't think any government would ever intentionally try to cause hurt and anger. But I do see the reasoning for creating more parity and equality for men and women when it comes to being in receipt of a state pension. But this is something that Waspie women, of course, also recognise. It has never been about the decisions, it's about how the decisions were carried out. And I think that's why it's right for the UK Government to carefully consider the Ombudsman's findings before updating MPs in Westminster. Some MSPs this afternoon have reflected on the Waspie campaign and particular journeys of women. We have heard that women have been negatively impacted, whether that be financially or emotionally, by decisions that have been taken. And of course, the First Minister rightly mentioned that all political party leaders have pledged their support to the Waspie campaign. Presiding Officer, there's been a long list of women mentioned by colleagues who have never given up, who have kept going and have made sure that their voices have been heard. And I think it is right to pay tribute to Sheila, Linda, Lorraine and every woman who has written a letter, who has attended an elected member's surgery or given evidence about how they have been affected by the changes in state pension age. Some of our MP colleagues have also been mentioned: Caroline Harris, Tim Houghton, Peter Aldis, all of taking this issue to Westminster to fight on behalf of women. Presiding Officer, MSPs this afternoon have referenced the report from the Parliamentary and Health Services Ombudsman, and it's fair to say that the outcome of the report has caused a lot of the discussions today. It has taken 5 long years. This issue has been raised consistently by Ros McCall and others, but the report also concluded that there has been significant issues, even though that it has concluded that timely and accurate information was available about changes to the number of qualifying years needed for a full state pension. But I think it is the case that many women did not understand the situation in terms of their own personal circumstances, how the new state pension impacted them personally, and that the DWP did not adequately use feedback and research to improve its service and performance. That's the unintended consequences that have been referenced by Jeremy Balfour and others. The report also concluded the maladministration of DWP's complaint handling that's caused complaints and unnecessary distress and anxiety, also the lost opportunity for women to make informed decisions about personal autonomy and financial control. But most importantly, the report has recommended that those suffering injustice be compensated financially, and I don't think anybody who has made a contribution today in the Chamber has argued otherwise. That's why the Scottish Conservatives, in our motion today, calls on the UK Government to respond in full to the substantial report and its recommendations contained as quickly as possible, including that of compensation. Presiding Officer, Douglas Ross gave a passionate speech that aims to unite Parliament, and our amendment today is also one of consensus. MSPs were asked earlier to rise to the challenge. Yes, I will.
Christine Graham.
I think the issue with your amendment is you seem content with the maximum level of the member seems content that the maximum level of compensation is £2,950. Surely the member cannot think that that is a reasonable offer.
Megan Gallagher.
I thank Christine Graham for her intervention. Douglas Ross explained in an intervention to Maggie Chapman earlier on that this is about getting consensus from the Parliament today, and we could certainly return to look at those issues. I think that is a reasonable ask. This is about trying to unite Parliament. That was the discussions that we had earlier on, and I'm hoping that that is one that we should all be able to rise to today, especially now that we've got different circumstances and we're now working within a minority government situation in Parliament. I think this is the first test, Presiding Officer, and it is one of the best opportunities actually to try and unite MSPs behind WASPI women. This shouldn't be about party lines. Politicians of every party has raised issues about the WASPI campaign, and I do think we can come back to issues about compensation at a later date. We can have another debate on WASPI women in the WASPI campaign. It is a really important issue, and I don't think there's any issue with coming back and having those discussions again. But if I could reflect on Beatrice Wishart's speech, which was one that I really enjoyed listening to, because it was about how we saw the rise of feminism in this country, and how some of the women impacted were actually the women who were behind that rise of feminism, making sure that they were fighting for equality, equal rights, and standing up for rights through really difficult times. They've tried to make their lives better for future generations, and of course they are the stalwarts who have passed the baton on to younger women for them to continue on that fight to achieve equality. So I will close today by echoing the calls made by Douglas Ross and ask the Government if they could support our amendment tonight. We are trying to reach beyond the political divide to send a unified message to the UK Government that the recommendations be implemented in full and that the women impacted receive the compensation that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Shirley Ann Somerville to wind up the debate up to 9 minutes. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And it's a privilege to close this very important debate on behalf of the Scottish Government. And it is also a privilege to do so alongside my friend and colleague, the First Minister. His support for the WASPI women is unquestionable and unwavering, as his support for equality and his fight against injustice. And I look forward to campaigning side by side with him once again in the future, just as we did long before we got involved in elected politics together. Now on to this very important issue today, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government has been consistent in our calls for the UK Government to immediately right the wrongs suffered by the WASPI women. With the publication of the PHSO report, the UK Government simply cannot waste any more time. Compensation must be delivered now and in full. Now, along with the First Minister, I had the privilege to meet some of the WASPI campaigners here in Parliament once again today, to hear once again directly from them about the need, which I fully agree on, for the urgent action for the UK Government. As the First Minister said to them and has repeated in the Chamber again this afternoon, this is about justice and it's about compensation. And I do think and hope this is something that we can unite on. Now, the PHSO report clearly identifies the need for compensation due to maladministration through the DWP Failures Act promptly in writing to the women impacted by the changes in the state pension age. They also, incidentally, called on governments to prioritise this action. Now, it's vital that the UK Government and the DWP takes responsibility for these failings, but also that it delivers that full compensation package at the earliest possible time. And I would call on the UK Government to listen to the WASPI women's calls for a comprehensive compensation, taking into account the financial hardship suffered, coupled with the UK Government having one of the worst gender pension gaps in the OECD. Presiding Officer, it is time to stop letting women down. Absolutely. Now, in the PHSO report, there is criticism, quite rightly, against the maladministration when communicating the equalisation of state pension age for men and women. As the First Minister has noted in his remarks, this Government fully supports Alan Brown MP's bill carrying full cross-party support, which calls on the UK Government to publish a compensation framework for WASPI women set at £3,000 to £10,000 or more. Something the WASPI campaigners also feel would be a fairer outcome, given the wider financial hardship this devastating policy has had. Kenny Gibson, quite rightly, has highlighted Patricia Gibson's backbench business debate. Now, those are two opportunities, Presiding Officer, for Tories and Labour to support WASPI women, or not, and they will be judged on their action or inaction on this case. Now, the PHSO have made the highly unusual step of urging the UK Parliament to intervene to make sure the UK Government acts on the recommendations in the report, and I hope the debate will add to those calls. Not only has the UK Government failed to take any clear commitment to addressing this report seriously or urgently, but it's also disappointing to note that there have been no calls from other UK Parliament parties calling on the UK Government to act on the findings of this report, with the exception of the SNP. Certainly.
Douglas Ross. I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, and she is summing up this debate in the spirit it's been held, one of fairly consensual contributions. The amendment I've lodged today absolutely states that the UK Government should respond to the PHSO report in full, including the recommendation on compensation, and do so as a matter of urgency. It's almost identical language to the Scottish Government's motion. Could they, even at this late stage in the debate, consider supporting my amendment so the message then that goes to the UK Government is one of unanimity from the Scottish Parliament, and then we come back at a later date, at a time scheduled by the Government, supported by us, to have a full debate on the entire WASPI compensation?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was going to come to the Tory amendment later, but let me do so now. The Government can't support it, and I'll be very clear about why. It takes out, you must now urgently deliver on the Ombudsman recommendation to pay compensation in full to those women without delay. You then take out, or the Scottish Conservatives then take out, the WASPI women's calls for higher levels of compensation. So, with the greatest respect, I listened very carefully to what Douglas Ross said today, but we can't just go on the words in the chamber. Let's look at the devil in the detail of what the Conservative amendment means, and I'm afraid that is letting WASPI women down again, and we simply will not do that today, Presiding Officer. Now, Presiding Officer, this is a minority parliament, and that does bring new and greater responsibility for those of us within government, but also across the chamber. Now, I'm very aware as a Scottish Government Minister of my responsibilities in a minority government. And I know that whoever takes office as First Minister in the coming weeks will do that too. I take that very, very seriously. But my ask today is to unite on the WASPy Women campaign calls. That's what we're trying to do in the Scottish Government today. Because minority government doesn't just shine a light on the Scottish Parliament, it shines a light on how we all act within it. It shines a light on what we will vote on today. So this is the first substantive vote since we've served as a minority. So we all have a choice, every single one of us. And the representatives of the WASPy Women are in the gallery today. Now, I've dealt with the Tory amendment. Let me come to Labour. And I do ask them what they will do tonight, because many of the WASPy women will have met with them over the years. They will have marched with them. They will have applauded with them. But the difficulty with the Labour amendment is that there's caveats now on that compensation. There was no caveats when they marched together. There was no caveats when they applauded them. And this is where there is a real, genuine possibility to not delay as the Conservatives have, to not put caveats on as the Labour Party have, but to come together to serve the WASPy women as I think they want us to do. And I'm happy to give way to Paul O'Kane.
Paul O'Kane.
I'm very grateful. I do find it quite bewildering that this government has decided not to back, I think, a reasonable amendment from the Labour Party, which has sought to create a consensus, has sought to create the voice of WASPy women in the preparation of that compensation scheme, but crucially also seeks to protect the triple lock. I find that very strange indeed.
Cabinet Secretary.
Now, I greatly respect Paul O'Kane, so I'm sure he didn't mean to somehow suggest that if we back the WASPy women, you can't back the triple lock. You can do both things, presiding officer, on this. But I don't think that's what he meant, and I think that's important to say. The reason why there's a difficulty with the Labour amendment is that, as Maggie Chapman pointed out, given the figures that we have, seven women may have died as we've talked about this today. That's 7 WASPy women. They don't have time for us to have another debate. They don't have time for us to think about that level of compensation. Their asks have been clear. Their asks have been clear for years now. We have that opportunity, yes, to unite. We keep this motion simple about what the WASPy women have asked for, and that's what I would urge Parliament to do today. Don't listen to me, don't even listen to the First Minister, listen to the WASPy women in the gallery and those that they represent. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on WASPy, Women Against State Pension Inequality. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 13042 in the name of George Adam on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme, and I call on George Adam to move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and moved.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak on the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 13042 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of business motions 13043 and 13044 on Stage 2 timetables for bills. And I ask any member who wishes to speak on the motions to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on George Adam, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motions.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak on the motions. Therefore, the question is that motions 13043 and 13044 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motions are therefore agreed. And the next item of business is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau motion 13045 on parliamentary recess dates. And I ask George Adam, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motion.
Gladly moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. And there are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that Amendment 13041.2 in the name of Douglas Ross, which seeks to amend motion 13041 in the name of Humza Yousaf on WASPy, Women Against State Pension Inequality, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. I would be grateful, given that members have already voted today, if they might refresh their screens before we move on to the vote. The question is that Amendment 13041.2 in the name of Douglas Ross, which seeks to amend Motion 13041 in the name of Humza Yousaf on WASPI, Women Against State Pension Inequality, be agreed, and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. Point of order, Christine Graham.
My gadget wouldn't connect and I would have voted no.
Thank you, Ms Graham. We'll ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 13041.2 in the name of Douglas Ross is yes 31, no 74. There were 21 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 13041.1 in the name of Paul O'Kane, which seeks to amend motion 13041 in the name of Humza Yousaf on WASPI, Women Against State Pension Inequality, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yeah, no. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 13041.1 in the name of Paul O'Kane is yes 21, no 95. There were 11 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that motion 13041 in the name of Humza Yousaf on WASPI, Women Against State Pension Inequality, be agreed. Are we all agreed? The The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote, and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed.
Doesn't need one, but
The result of the vote on motion 13041 in the name of Humza Yousaf is yes 75. There were no votes against. There were 52 abstentions. And the motion is therefore agreed. And the final question is that motion 13045 in the name of George Adam on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on parliamentary recess dates be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed. That concludes decision time. A point of order, Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm seeking a clarification on an email circulated from the Chief Executive's office to all MSPs in relation to the protest camp currently taking place outside Parliament. I understand entirely that if an MSP or a member of staff were to take part in camping outside, that we or they would indeed have breached the policy. But I've been contacted by a number of staff and by other MSPs who are unsure because there's some ambiguity about the message that's been sent to us, and some are left under the impression that any engagement at all with those taking part in the protest, simply speaking to them on the way in or out of this building, would also be in breach of that policy. I was wondering if you could offer reassurance to MSPs and staff that simply by speaking to those who are protesting outside, that we would not have breached the Parliament's protest policy.
Thank you, Mr Greer. As you will be aware, that is not a question as to whether proper procedures are or have been followed in the Chamber. The Code of Conduct for MSPs states that members must abide by the policies that are adopted by the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, and one of these policies, the protest policy, includes the restriction that protesters should not camp at any time, including overnight, for protest or any other reason. And it has been made clear to the current protesters that while we support the right to protest at Holyrood, they do not have permission to camp on the Parliament's grounds, and they're not in compliance with the corporate body's protest policy. And it is expected that members would withdraw from any protest that breaches the terms and conditions set out in the Parliament's policy. We will now move on to members' business in the name of Maggie Chapman.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.